Welcome to the meeting. We knew there would be several members that could not be here today. I think Dr. Michael is in the hospital or has had some surgery. He's not here. And then Barbara Hampton, our state board member, is had a conflict, and then I'm not sure if several other people could be with us today. Hopefully Representative Stovall will be with us.
She's on her way. She's on her way.
Okay,
she's on her way.
And to all of our visitors, we appreciate you being here. We hope that this will be a very good day for us as we proceed again to finalize a report to the governor that's due on December 1st. As a matter of fact, I think that should give us ample time if we don't write too long. But let me really thank each of you for your participation. We've had several members that have stepped up to the plate for presentations. You'll see that happening today in a couple of 3 instances, and hopefully the information that you're getting is information that moves us down the road to select what we think will make a good model for Leadership Academy for the state of Georgia. So with that in mind, you have a copy of the agenda. We will follow the agenda. I didn't put lunch in here, but thanks to Martha and Todd, we will have lunch today. When will it be here, Martha?
They're supposed to be here with it at 11:30 or so
Okay.
I'll let Bernie know.
So we're on schedule then for lunch. That's the big schedule we want to make sure we meet, okay? Now seriously, thank you again for being here. We hope to get a lot accomplished today, and we're going to start off with really something that we've been needing in the state for a good while, and that's some idea of how many principals do we have and that kind of thing, and where we can hopefully have a principal. We would refer to it as a leadership dashboard that gives us an idea of how many principals we have. But more importantly, how many will we need? When will they be eligible to retire? Doesn't mean that they will retire, but that's about the best information you have is when they are eligible to retire. It gives you a lot of information. And we know that a lot of people out there that, like me, have a lot of years before they're able to retire. And so, you just sort of drop them out of the, that didn't get quite the reaction that I thought. It's still early yet. But in any case, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad of every year that I've had the privilege to live, and hopefully I have done a few things that's added really value to what's happening in this great nation that we're able to live. With that, let me ask Martha Ann if she would to talk to us a little bit about the Georgia Public School principals and assistant principals. And I think all of you know, as the research that we've reviewed, the two people that make the greatest difference in the achievement of students or teachers and principals. And of course, you will have to sort of include assistant principals in that, and that they hopefully will become a principal at some point in time. So Martha Ann has really put this together for us, and I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And I can't claim any credit. I just looked at my team and said, we need to know this, and they went to work. So it's a great team working at GOSA. As you can see by the title, we just have an overview of the leadership experience, age, and retirement status of principals and assistant principals in Georgia. I'm not going to read this to you. I do want to hit a couple of highlights and draw your attention to begin with. At the very back of the book, there's a series of maps that will just help you have some geographical context for some of the information that you're looking at. There's a map of the RISA districts. There's a map that shows the districts in the state by the count of building level leaders. A map that shows the districts that have 35 or 100 fewer students. We mentioned that several times last session. And another map that shows where the chronically failing schools as of January 2017 are located. Just a couple of highlights about the information in here. District size comparison was something that we had to make some decisions about, and so we have the definition in the overview that we chose to use. Small districts, there were 76 with fewer than 10 principals and assistant principals. Mid-sized districts, there are 79 that have 11 to 50. Because of the large number of small districts with just a few individuals in these leadership positions, we were not comfortable reporting this data out at a district or school level because it would be too easily identifiable. So what you're seeing is reported out at the state level and then by RISA areas, which I think is actually a pretty useful way to look at it. You also see the number of large districts. There are 11 districts that have 51 to 100 and 13 districts that have more than 100 principals and assistant principals. So it really gives you an idea of the scale and the scope of the leadership in the districts around the state. The average principal has 9 years of building level experience, and principals in small districts generally have less building level experience than those in large districts. 41% of the principals in our state have 3 or fewer years experience as a principal. So there's been a lot of change in principals in the state in the last few years. The average age is 48. Most are younger than 54 or younger. 1/4, listen carefully, 1/4 of the principals in the state are currently eligible for retirement, and another 29% will be eligible in the next 5 years. That's 50 plus percent eligible now or in the next 5 years. In districts with 100 or fewer leaders, it's actually 6 in 10 that are eligible now or will be eligible in the next 5 years. The average assistant principal has about 5 years of building level experience. Again, with the smaller districts, they tend to have less. And the average assistant principal is a little bit younger than the average principal, 45 instead of 48. 1/3 of the assistant principals in the state are currently eligible for retirement or will be within the next 5 years. That's 46% in the small districts. So I will say that as you look through all the graphs through the book, you will see principals and assistant principals by district and RISA broken out by age, broken out by years of experience, and broken out by their retirement status. When I go through this and look at this, it calls to my mind 2 things. One is that there is very obviously a need for principal development in our state. Even if every principal in every building is 100% competent and effective today, we're going to have a big turnover in the next few years. And we need to be prepared for that. And so that also brings the focus to the opportunity that we have as we do this work to really set the stage to build a very strong preparation program and pipeline for the state of Georgia in the future. For those of you in the back, if I didn't already give you a copy, there's some extra copies up here on the corner if you'd like to have it. And at some point in the next few days, this will also be available on our website. Thank you.
Offhand, if I may, one of the things that we put a lot of focus on is the principal pipeline preparation. But education's like all the things around us, things change. And people who are in leadership positions also need to be refreshed. If not refreshed, obviously help learn a few things that maybe we didn't get in preparation. And that's another, I think, big challenge that we have. If you've been in this business 20 years, how you operated 20 years ago was very different from how you operate today. Actually, even 10 years.
I would agree 100% with that. Absolutely. There's a lot of potential for development of new leaders and supporting continued development of the current leaders that are in place. Especially when you consider how many have 3 to 5 years of experience in that position, they still are learning and have a lot to learn.
Martha, if I could could ask you a couple questions related to this, and you and I have had this conversation, and this just supports what we've talked about for so long. Any feeling for how that compares to individual teachers in terms of where they are in career? Because we also hear equally alarming stories about where teachers are. That's question number one in terms of where they are in their careers and the lack of a pipeline. But number two, any feel for transiency? What kind of principals stay in districts? What kind of principals move? Because my gut would tell me we would see tremendous differences based on student performance, based on demographics, based on areas of the state. Did your folks look at any of that in terms of transiency? How long in particular areas people are staying in principalships?
We have some information about how long principals are in a particular district, not necessarily in a particular building. There wasn't anything in there that we thought was really highly revealing in terms of decision making. You might find some information there that would be specific to a particular area that you might want to, as you dig down into the district level or the RISA level data a little bit more, maybe look at. We were trying to give a big picture view here that you could look at to make decisions from the state level. But on a statewide basis, there was no particular pattern that we thought we needed to bring to this group to look at. As far as the teacher workforce, we did report last year on the teacher and leader workforce pipeline, which we will update this year. I don't recall the numbers right off the top of my head. I can get you that information, and it's also on our website, but I'll be glad to email it to you as well. The teacher pipeline is not, the teacher workforce availability or the number of teachers available to work is not as dire as what you hear said many times. Actually, what we have is plenty of teachers. We have geographic limitations and needs, and we have subject area limitations and needs. We have way more elementary teachers being produced than our districts need to hire. We don't have nearly enough math and science teachers, and the further out you go into rural Georgia, the harder and harder that is to come by. We also heard a lot of talk about teachers leaving the profession quickly, and last year the data that we went through showed that about 12% of the early career teachers, that's in the first 5 years, actually left teaching, which we did not find to be highly different from any other profession, especially now as we're dealing with young people who are changing careers much more often than you and I have done. So I'll send you that information.
Thank you very much, Martha. And anybody else have a comment or question for you? Okay, we'll move down to item 4. We have another panel for you, and for our guest today, the word is that we've outlawed PowerPoints. We have not outlawed PowerPoints. We just don't use any, or we haven't to date. But I think we might be reaching the stage where we may need to use PowerPoint. My point is, this will be the 4th panel that we've had. So my read is that you've enjoyed the panel more than you would a PowerPoint. So we really appreciate the people that are here, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pethel, who has arranged for this panel today, and will also serve as our moderator.
Chairman Wilbanks and distinguished members of the study committee, it's a great pleasure for me to have 4 colleagues and friends that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with for several years now. And as I said to you at our last meeting, I recognize these individuals as experts. And not only do I see them as experts or leaders in the field, but a number of other organizations do as well. And specifically, I would point to the study that we shared with you at the last meeting that was compiled by Policy Studies Associates. And you will recall that within that study, several states were identified, but certainly the states of Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Delaware were identified as states that, again, have done significant work in the area of leadership development, leadership training, and leadership support. So at this time, I'm going to ask our friends from out of state to join me here at the front of the room. And again, committee members, you will recall that earlier this month, we sent you a copy of our goals or objectives for this conversation, and also the questions that we would use as a guide to help us drill down, perhaps highlight, perhaps shed more light on some of the work that's being done across these 4 states. So if you'll give me just a moment to arrange the microphones, we'll get started. So again, I hope you have your copy of the information, so I don't want to read to you, but I do need to repeat who our panelists are this morning. And I'll start on my immediate right and on your left. Dr. Debbie Daniels is a long-time worker, employee with the Kentucky Department of Education. I've had the great pleasure of watching Debbie facilitate groups, and I often tell folks that she is one of the most skillful facilitators that I've ever observed, that I've ever worked with. And the reason I believe that is because she's able to cut to the heart of the matter. Mr. Wilbanks, she's very skillful at telling people when time's up, and I know most of us appreciate that skill. But Debbie, again, has very deep experience in the state of Kentucky, and we appreciate her being here. Next to her is Dr. Paul Katnick from the state of Missouri. Paul, we hope you appreciate the fact that we did pull for our home team last weekend. Paul is the Assistant Commissioner of Education in Missouri. And again, I know personally of the work that Paul has directed in the state of Missouri. Again, they are doing some wonderful things in that state. And one of the things that I will want to do with Paul, as with the other panel members, is to highlight perhaps some of the similarities in their state to Georgia, as well as perhaps some of the differences. Paul and I have talked about the number of school districts they have in Missouri. And I was amazed at the number. And I'll let him tell you how many they have and the size range they have in their state. So Paul, we appreciate you being with us this morning. Seated next to Paul is another Paul. Again, a great colleague and friend, Dr. Paul Fleming from the state of Tennessee. Paul is the Assistant Commissioner of Education for Teacher and Leaders. And I personally know of his work in Tennessee, some of the initiatives that have come from their commissioner, and have had the pleasure of working with Paul and his colleagues on some of their more recent innovation grants. Again, Paul, we appreciate you being here this morning. And last but not least is my dear friend, longtime colleague, Dr. Jackie Wilson. Jackie is the director of the Delaware Academy of School Leadership. Again, our acquaintance goes back in time, and Dr. Wilson has some close ties to the South. I don't know how you categorize Delaware, but so she says it's Southern. But Jackie works out of the University of Delaware. So again, I know about their work, and again, I couldn't think of a more distinguished, more experienced group of people to bring to you and hopefully engage you in a conversation about what works and perhaps some of the things that do not work at a state level. So Debbie, if you're okay, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about Kentucky. Specifically, tell us about the number of school districts, public school districts, that you have in Kentucky, and talk a little bit about the mix of school districts in your state. My guess is, if I'm just guessing, Louisville and Lexington might be probably the two largest cities I could mention that I know about, but talk a little bit about that. Sort of give us a little bit of flavor of what your state looks like.
Well, currently we have 173 school districts. 120 of those are public schools districts and 53 are independent districts. And as Dr. Pethel mentioned, we have really, when we talk about large urban districts in Kentucky, Louisville, Jefferson County is the one that we recognize. Lexington, Fayette County kind of falls in that, but it's a lot suburban as well. And from there we go to primarily the state is rural school districts. We have several districts that are a one school district that have P12 in one building. So one of the things you'll hear me talk about later is we can't send Jefferson County to Robertson County, a one school district, and say this is how you need to do things. It just doesn't work. So that's one of my takeaways and shares with you today is that they want to hear from the people who are from another one school district to try to help them understand what is it that we can actually accomplish. Something I found interesting when I was doing a little research after talking with Dr. Pethel was we have 34 female superintendents, 139 male, and 4 minorities in Kentucky. So I think that's a good discussion topic for the state and especially a leadership academy as far as how we try to recruit and support our females and minorities in the state to see that we get more of those in leadership roles. 655,475 students, and of course 101,000 of those, 11 I think are from Jefferson County. So that kind of shows you the size of that one county compared to the rest. One of the things I thought was very interesting and something that through a lot of the work that's been done at the State Department over the last 10 years is really looking at nationally certified teachers. You were talking about teachers earlier. And Kentucky ranks 6th in the nation in the most nationally certified teachers. And so we're really pleased with that number. Now, one of the shocking factors, and I'll kind of end it with this, is that when we looked at statewide support for teachers, and with our professional standards board, we actually have an internship program that supports teachers in their first year. And right now we have 2,323 teachers in that program. We also, by law, have a principal internship program, but no funding for it. So we have 0 principals who are in their first year and in their internship year and have no support from the state level.
So obviously, somebody thought that was a good idea somewhere along the way, but you just haven't obviously seen any funding resources for that. So Debbie, there are obviously some similarities then to the state of Georgia in the fact that you've got some large urban centers, but your state probably has more rural, smaller school districts. And again, you've heard us say this morning, Martha Ann illustrated that's very much the case here in our state as well. So again, we think Kentucky, again, because of some of those similarities, offers some good information for us.
And 71% of them are Title I school districts.
Okay, thank you. Paul Catnick from the state of Missouri. So Paul, I hope I set the stage here to get them ready. So tell us about Missouri, but tell us about, first of all, the number of school districts you've got.
Good morning, everyone. The state of Missouri has 518 school districts. When you add in our charter school communities, you're at about 555. We range from over 25,000 students in one school district to a school district that has 23. Over 300 of the school districts in this state have less than 1,000 students. But if you want to find yourself in a contentious conversation quickly, just say the word consolidation, and you'll find yourself in a big conversation. Interestingly enough, I thought the data shared this morning about your principals and assistant principals was really helpful. We have actually 2,200 principals in the state, very, very close to what you have. 1,300 assistant principals, and for us, that means the target number is 3,500. What we have decided over the last couple of years is that principal development has to be done at scale. And I'll flesh out for you a little bit more some of the work we've done over the last 3 decades and why it hasn't worked, and why that number of 3,500 is really important. Over 900,000 students, 68,000 teachers, and as I told you, hundreds and hundreds of school districts. We don't close very often, and we don't consolidate at all.
Talk to us about that largest school district. You and I talked about that, the one that's got over 25,000 kids. Where is that?
That's actually in Springfield, Missouri. It's the Springfield Public School System. Most people would wager a guess at St. Louis or Kansas City. Those are, over the last years, have lost students, and so are no longer the largest school districts. Matter of fact, some of our suburban school systems in both of those metropolitan areas have more students than that urban system does. But Springfield Public Schools is the one that has over 25,000 students.
So again, Paul, the vast majority of your students, though, are served in smaller. And so talk about rural. What does rural look like in your state?
A lot of we have some K-8 systems, about 60 of those, and then we have, as Debbie said, we have a lot of K-12 and pre-K-12 systems. We have some where a leader serves as superintendent and principal, both. I think the reason we have far less assistant principals than Georgia has is because our systems, over 300, have less than 1,000 students, and so it isn't, economically feasible to have a principal and assistant principal. So for us, the real challenge is, and when we look at our charter schools too, is we have a lot of principals who do absolutely everything. And when you try to talk to them about their own growth and development, I think they spend so much time working on everyone else's that there's very little for them. But what we found, as we look at the research and stuff, is that nothing makes it in the school system if it doesn't include the principal. Superintendents with grand ideas for reform, when they send it down to the principal level, it's going to live or die based on the principal. And we, for the last 3 decades, have way underinvested in our principals compared to all the other work that we've done. So we're big believers in that number 3,500. We've got to find a way to do it at scale.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Dr. Paul Fleming from the state of Tennessee. Again, your state is large, and it certainly encompasses a wide range from east to west or west to east, Paul. And you also have some large urban centers. So talk to us a little bit about the number of school districts that you have in Tennessee, and much like Paul Catt did, give us a flavor for size, number of principals that you have across the state.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Bethlehem. Good morning, and pleasure to be here. And I think other than the recent Georgia University of Tennessee football result, we have a lot of things in common with Georgia and also
And
Missouri.
most of you guys came anyway. That really does speak.
It was touch and go.
That speaks of your commitment. I appreciate that.
That's right. We're still proud, but but we do have a lot of similarities. So in Tennessee, we have just under 1 million students. We have 146 districts. We have 1,800 schools, so with the 1,800 principals, and we also have 5 large urban districts, which for the first time, going to Debbie's point, are led by African American male superintendents for the first time, I think, ever. Our 5 large urban districts, which we're quite proud of. We have about 100 rural districts that are classified as rural out of that 146, so we have quite the range. And one thing I'll continue to talk about is, like Paul in Missouri, is how to train at scale, because we found, similar to the report that we heard from this morning, in Tennessee, we had a steady turnover of about 10% of our principals we need to replace every year. So about 200, 220 of our principals every year, and we felt that that was very manageable and very doable to have the governor and have the state involved at that scale, because unlike the 68,000 teachers we have, we know that impact of that training of those 200 a year and putting transformational leaders in place could really be done. And so that was an aha moment to realize that we need that 200 and that training and that focus. And we'll talk about the Governor's Academy that we started in Tennessee a couple years ago as well, to help reach that goal of that 200 as well. So that's, I think, some key points of where we are in Tennessee, and it's also thinking again about the impact and the training is we revised our leadership standards a couple years ago to really move principals from managers to instructional leaders, and making that evident in the principal evaluation as a policy lever to really push on teacher leadership, collaborative leadership in a way that I think is also moving the needle in Tennessee.
Good. Thanks, Paul. Last but not least, Dr. Jackie Wilson. So Jackie, you know, when I think about Delaware, I think about this little, small state.
Absolutely.
But you have this understanding of the South.
Exactly.
So if you can help us sort of understand, again, the similarities in your state.
Sure.
Do you have rural districts, for example?
We have lots of rural districts.
Okay,
So I'll say to all of you, and thank you very much for having me here to kind of share our experiences. I want to preface this, and Glenn knows I'm probably going to say this, is I always speak from the voice of a principal. I was a principal. It's the best job I ever had. It was the hardest job I ever had. So I take that with me, that hat, everywhere I go. And I spent 30 years in the schoolhouse. Then I went to the Department of Education, and that's when I really was able to leverage state policy around school leadership, and particularly conditions for principals, and then got recruited to go to the university where I've been for the past 12 years. But I want to talk to you about Delaware, because everyone said, oh, it's small, you can do anything there. You can get things done because you bring people together in 2 hours. And what I've had this conversation many times with my colleagues who I engage with across the country is, think of Delaware as one of a region of your state. If we can do it, you should be able to regionalize it anywhere in this state using some of the same strategies we've had because we're a relationship business anyway. And so it's about building those relationships as conditions for the work. So I'm feeling a little sad. We had this conversation in the car on the way over here. We have 136,000 students. We have, out of those students, 46% are white, 31% are African American, 16% are Hispanic, and 7% fall into that category of other. 36% are low income, 14% of those students are special education, and 6% are English second language. Delaware has 3 counties, 19 school districts. So we hear that word consolidation every time someone runs for office, because as a way to save money. And this year when we had a huge budget crisis, we have 6 vocational schools. Our vocational schools are in 3 districts. They have a different funding stream. We have 25 charter schools. So for a small state, that's really a lot of charter schools. We're a very charter-friendly state. We have 3 magnet schools. Out of that, we have about 9,000 teachers, and we have 200 principals and about 500 assistant principals. We have great policy legislation that allows larger, based on the number of students in a school, you can have additional assistant principals. So Delaware has one, or what I call truly urban school district, which is in Wilmington, right outside of Philadelphia. And it is where our lowest performing schools tend to be. But we also have 2 quarters. If you think of Delaware as a peninsula, we have 2 quarters. We have the western quarter, which is extremely rural and very small school districts. You might have 1 high school, middle school, and a couple elementary schools on that western quarter. It's very, we grow poultry and all the things that support poultry. We are a poultry state. Purdue, Mount Ayr, all those. I think Georgia has some poultry here as well. I actually live on a poultry farm, just so you know. And then on the eastern side of our state, which I kind of call the wealthier side of our state, because we also are a peninsula and we have the coast. And so the eastern side seems to generate more tax dollars, and so it's a little wealthier side. So we are small. But one of the things, and I think one of the reasons that Glenn invited me today is we have made leadership important in Delaware for probably 15 years. We were an original state where our governor realized the value of the economic value of great schools, that people move to the state, businesses come to the state if you have a great school system. And there was a flight out to private, and we're also a big choice state. So we really began to talk about leadership and what leadership looked like, and we looked at 3 things. We looked at policies that supported training programs, and training could be professional development or it could be pre-service preparation, professional development. Also looking at performance evaluation was very important for teachers and leaders, and we really looked at improving university preparation programs for leaders. So we looked at those conditions and a set of standards that guided leadership. So we have really worked on that since about probably 2000. And for those of you who are familiar, some of us, it's a memory that we kind of want to forget, but through Race to the Top, leadership was the center of our plan, and everything else went out from that. So that's a little about Delaware.
Great. So, just so you will know this, some of us actually were born in poultry capital of the world. So it's just up the road, Gainesville, Georgia, right?
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So
It generates revenue.
So there are other people in the room, as you would expect, Jackie, you understand.
You get it. You get it.
But we appreciate the reference, though, because again, I suppose I'll use myself. I don't think of Delaware as having small rural school districts. So I appreciate you highlighting and illustrating that for us. So you've heard from 4 experts, people who have very deep experience in working at a state level. Again, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, with large numbers of principals and assistant principals. Their numbers are more like Georgia than perhaps Delaware. But I think one of the things I hope that you took away from this brief introduction is that there is an emphasis on the training, the development of school leaders, that, as Paul Katnick pointed out, keeping that number in front of them is really important, so looking ahead. It also helps to illustrate and reinforce why it's so important for Martha Ann and her talented team to bring us real data about how many principals we have in the state of Georgia. But more importantly, what does the very near future look like? So that's where I want to sort of move our conversation now, because all 4 of these folks have experienced having questions raised about school leadership. And I want to get into what those questions were. So perhaps Paul Fleming, again, I know some of the very recent work you're doing. What problem were you attempting to solve in Tennessee? What I mean by that, were you just worried about the vacancies that might be occurring, or were you perhaps thinking about other things? So talk about the problem you were solving for in Tennessee.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate just like this report and the data, because when we started with that, we thought we had this kind of really surface level problem of 200 vacancies every year, about 10% that we needed to fill and to solve that problem. Then we started digging deeper because we had a similar, we call it Transformational Leadership Council that met for a year, very similar to this group. And we started digging in our data, and we found some interesting things that helped deepen the problem and change our focus when we were creating this Governor's Leadership Academy that we started 2 years ago. So one, we had 20 leadership preparation programs in Tennessee, and they were producing a significant number of candidates, like you heard on the teacher side in many states. And we realized that we actually had about 11,000 educators in Tennessee that had an administrative license, but only 5,000 that were practicing educators, or practicing leaders, if that makes sense. So we had a little bit of that glut, and we all know that reason because often it was tied to the pay and getting a master's degree. But when we also changed our strategic compensation plan a couple years ago, so that every district now had to design their own, picking from a menu of options, that helped illuminate the problem and realize that we didn't need necessarily to keep training and setting up a governor's academy that would result in licensure, because we already had so many folks that were in that boat. And so when we then, the council, we went and talked to superintendents around the state, realized the problem was more about the ongoing training. Because of the standard shifts, because of all the instructional shifts that are happening, they wanted folks who already had their initial license to receive high-quality transformational training, if that makes sense, since they already had their beginning administrative license. So instead of then creating a leadership academy that would have been a master's program resulting in initial licensure, which would have been about $1 million a year, because we partnered with Vanderbilt University, which we're fortunate to have in our backyard, to create a leadership academy, we decided to set then a 12-month training program for these folks that did not result in licensure or an advanced degree, but provided high-quality training. And I think that was the aha moment, was knowing our data, knowing what problem we were trying to solve, knowing that we had this, the numerous folks with the beginning license, and it was more a training issue, not a licensure issue. And that really helped set the stage for designing the Governor's Leadership Academy in Tennessee around high-quality training aligned to our standards for 25 assistant principals yearly, because we knew as well that we, just like Georgia, we had about 40% of our folks in their first 3 to 4 years. And so we knew we had to really build that pipeline in collaboration with our lead preparation programs. But this approach for the Governor's Academy was focusing on beginning assistant principals statewide at scale, and for the express purpose of training them to be a transformational leader in school. And that was, we're excited because now we have about half of those folks in the 2 years have already gone to the principal level, become principal. So if that makes sense, we really helped us define the problem as not one of licensure attainment, but more about ongoing training, and that's how we structured the academy.
Good, thank you, Paul. Debbie, talk a little bit about Kentucky. What problems were you solving?
Around 2003, the State Department, maybe it started about 2000, looked at the whole issue of how many low-performing schools we had. And they created a cadre of what at the time they called distinguished educators, later became called highly skilled educators. And their purpose was to go out and try to help the leadership in these schools to improve those schools. Similar to what I've heard was that, you know, with your large urban district in Jefferson County, we have 43 of the lowest performing schools in the state. And one of the statistics that I think contributes to some of that is looking at how many vacancies they have when school starts, as far as how many principals. And also, I know just this past year, 163 teacher vacancies at the time school started. So these kids aren't even getting off to a good start, so it's not hard to understand why that you have that kind of a problem. So as a part of that, we just recognize that to be able to improve the status of those schools, the Leithwood research came out about that time that, you know, really brought principalship to the forefront, saying that next to the teacher, principals make the greatest difference. And so now, I think the state felt like, and Dr. Gene Wilhoit, some of you may know him, he used to be at CCS and so in Kentucky, as executive director. But Gene really embraced that and said, this is how we're going to be able to improve these schools, is that we've got to do something to raise the effectiveness of the school leaders in the state. And so what they had pulled as far as highly skilled educators were those principals who had been out in the state and had made a difference in their schools. I fortunately was one of those. I came from I was a principal at a low-performing elementary, middle, and a high school. And I mean, they were all in the bottom 10 in the state. We were able to bring them up in every situation. And my last one was at a high school where we were the lowest in our whole region, and we came up to 3rd in 2 years. And we're able to improve our test scores, our statewide test scores, by 20 points. It almost killed me, but we were able to accomplish that. I was not a very popular person for a long time in that area, but you know, we got the job done. So I knew I'd been in that, had that experience. I knew what it took to be able to turn these schools around. So we were very fortunate at that time to be able to apply for and receive the Wallace Foundation grant. And we focused every bit of it, and it was on leadership. And so the 3 things we targeted, and as we go through the rest of the discussion this morning, I'll talk about those, was one was to redesign all of the principal preparation programs in the state. We really felt that they were very traditional. There was a lot that needed to be updated, a lot on field experiences that we were not providing to our candidates. And that's why that we had to go to the beginning training ground to start making a difference with our school leaders. The other one was to develop leadership teams in all the districts and school offices around the state. And then the third one was to look at what are some strategies that we could use to make the principal's job doable. So that was our target for like the next 10 years. We continued even after the grant to try to look at that and to work on those in those 3 areas. We too, like Tennessee, we were having a turnover of 200 to 250 principals a year, and we looked over like a 5 or 6 year period, just in that short period of time. The numbers were increasing of principals we needed, and also the numbers of superintendents. We saw that number rising as well. So at the time, we had 13 universities in the state. And as I'll talk about, as we did a lot of this redesign with our university programs, we had 2 that just dropped out. They couldn't meet it. And so we were down to 11 university programs in the state that prepared principals.
So this has been a nice contrast. Paul, you describing that perhaps prep was not the problem you were solving for because the data indicated it was not a problem. Yet in Kentucky, you took a 3-pronged approach. And I also appreciate the fact, Debbie, that you highlighted that your problem was this concern about low-performing schools, which is certainly one of the things that is being addressed here in Georgia and is very much a part of the work of this Joint Study Committee. So, Paul Captain, talk a little bit about what you were solving for in Missouri.
In the state of Missouri, we had a math problem. We have had a leadership academy for over 3 decades. It's in its 33rd year. And every single year we run 100 to 170 principals through the leadership academy. 12 years back, the Wallace Foundation helped us set up a mentoring program. We put in rule that all brand new principals had to be mentored, one-to-one mentoring, and with the support of the Wallace Foundation, we got them one-to-one mentors. And so we worked with 100 to 150 brand new principals every year on mentoring. And then a couple of years back, we brought in NISL content, National Institute of School Leadership, and created a program just for turnaround principals, and we worked with cohorts of about 100 of those. And yet, the needle wasn't moving. So Missouri's in the middle. It's in the middle of the country. If you look at our ELA percentages, I think we rank 17th, 18th in the country. If you look at math, we're 22nd or 23rd. We're in the middle. And for 3 decades of leadership development, we have not been moving the needle. Our churn numbers are alarming. We're about 14%. We unfortunately joke that we are especially burning the heck out of our secondary principals. They don't leave our secondary schools to go do other work. They go for therapy because we kill them. And so we had these churn numbers. We're not moving the needle on student performance. And 2.5 years back, we said, what are we doing wrong? Because we have been doing the Leadership Academy. We've been doing the work of that. And yet we weren't moving numbers. And that's why the word scale is what comes back to it. Even working at full throttle, we're working with about 500 principals per year. We're working ourselves to death. We're working hard. We feel good. I could line up principals for you who would say that was the best PD I ever had. It was, terrific. I love it. But 500 and 3,500 are 2 very, very different numbers. By the time, we would have to work for a decade just to get every principal through, and that's if they don't leave in that time frame. So we concluded that the reason we're not moving the needle is because we're not doing it at scale. We're helping small batches of principals for a little while, and then they move on or they move out, and we replace them with new ones who need work. And so we were really, really busy at what I think was good work, but we weren't in transformational work. And I think for us in Missouri, we've concluded that our problem was to be transformational. We have to think bigger. We have to think at scale, and we need a system that addresses every principal, no matter what kind of school they're in or where they're at in their career.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about particularly what you've done recently and how you see that as a phase-in to. Okay, Paul and I talked a good deal about that, so I'm interested in that. Jackie, what were you attempting to solve for? So again, you've been doing this for some time. Yeah.
It's really interesting how I landed at the Department of Education, because I was very happy in my school district as a principal. But as what happens in every state is you do good work, people invite you to be on committees. And so if you're a good steward, you participate because you don't want to complain if you don't add value. So I was on several committees, one of which was with, as I said earlier, the governor was concerned about the importance of leadership in our state, but he had drafted a piece of legislation with legislators regarding professional accountability. And this was the start of how we're holding teachers and principals accountable for student achievement. We were early into that game back in about around 1999 to 2000, starting to talk about student achievement and how we were going to hold people accountable for that. So we had a group about this size in a room, and I happened to be on there representing principals because I was the president of the Elementary Principals Association. And the consultant who was brought to Delaware to talk to us about the area of school leadership happened to be from Vanderbilt University, Dr. Joe Murphy. So one of the things that the conversation was how we're going to, policy's great, but you got to breathe life into it. So they had all this professional accountability. The governor wanted this to happen. The Secretary of Education wanted this to happen. So the next thing I know, I am called and asked to come work at the Department of Ed and to lead this work. But the office I was working in was licensure and certification. That is the worst office in the whole Department of Education. But this is where I discovered the problems, because there were so many factors about leadership, many of which we've already talked about, but I knew we had licensure and certification problems, who we were letting in, how they were getting in, the universities who were preparing them. We only have 3 universities preparing principals in our state. So we were getting people from other states, but we were also losing people to other states because we're a peninsula. So we're surrounded, I could just drive a little ways and be in New Jersey or Virginia. So I saw we had to address the issues of licensure and certification. We had to then begin to look at pre-service preparation. And every time we'd convene a really smart group of people, we saw we had no succession planning. We weren't planning for pipelines. You know what we were doing? Advertising. I need a high school principal, come on. And there was no criteria for that. We had a great evaluation system that was under redesign, and we began to see that as a lever for how we were going to change what our criteria was for those people we wanted in the pipeline. So we began to see that it meant we had to have some type of a pipeline program. And so I worked at the department on some of these areas, convening many groups of people together and began piloting some things. We too ended up getting a grant from the Wallace Foundation. They liked some of our ideas. They let us test. They let us test models of succession. They let us test some pipeline programs. They let us test a redesign of all our university preparation programs. They let us test a redesign of all our professional development criteria based on the ISLAC standards at that time. So we were testing ideas. Then when I decided that I was going to retire the first time, the secretary, when I decided I was going to go to this small little one-man operation at the University of Delaware, which was a little leadership academy. It was run by a retired superintendent, and the state gave him, the university, a small amount of state funds and said, do some training programs for school leaders. And I had been working with him on many committees, and I saw possibilities because he was really servicing Newcastle County after urban. And I said, why is that money not flowing? We have rural districts that need some. So what happened is I went to the university, and from that we were able to move the secretary saw the opportunity to move that leadership work out of the department where there was not so much compliance driven, and saw the opportunity to use this leadership academy at the University of Delaware with all our resources to really then begin to make that the hub of where we would develop training programs and supports and partnerships with school districts to provide them with the kinds of professional development and the kinds of technical assistance, and actually did a lot of work for the Department of Education and through the university.
Thanks, Jackie. What I've heard in this conversation is that each one of these states approach their work with a different problem that they consider. So Jackie, it was like, what do we do about the future for succession planning. I heard Paul Katnick talk about, but we're not moving. We've had an academy for 33 years, and we're all kind of happy with it, except for one big factor. Perhaps we don't have evidence that what we're doing is having an impact that we desire. We heard Dr. Daniels talk about their concern in Kentucky was about low-performing schools. And so they began on that work, and it took them in some different ways. Paul Fleming from Tennessee, again, you described your work that, again, we've got to transform some of the things that we're doing. We've got to do a better job, again, of getting people ready. And you gave us a little bit, you gave us a hint of evidence, Paul, that it's working for you there. So I want to dig a little bit deeper now, just take it down a couple of levels in terms of some of the detail, because I think this committee is really interested in, so how'd you do this stuff? But I'm also interested in the evidence. So even though perhaps you've only done something for 2 years like you have, Paul, are you beginning to see evidence that it's making a difference, or that it's actually giving you the answer to the problem that you sought to solve? So with that being said, I want each of you, and we'll start with Debbie Daniels, tell us a little bit about how your program was administered. And what I mean by that, did you set up an academy in your capital city and ask everybody to come there and become learned because of what you were doing? Or did you do something else? And if you did do something else, how did you do that, or how's it being done today? Okay? And we'll just go down the line. So Paul, if you'll follow Debbie with that.
At the time, we had a small department within the Department of Education that was focused on leadership. So there were about 3 of us. And our job was to serve, at that time, there were 175 school districts in the state. And it was our responsibility to serve all 175, meet the needs of all the school leaders, I was the person who was the direct contact to all districts as far as leadership information. And so what we found out is it was an impossible task. We could not meet the needs. We couldn't make enough one-on-one calls to answer their questions. So we said, okay, we'll do a newsletter, and we'll get it every week. We'll send out this newsletter that just gives them all the information, and then they'll know what they need to know. Well, you know how that goes. Half the time they didn't even read it or know when it came through in their mailbox, and if they did, they misinterpreted a lot of what was said, and it was not effective at all. And so then we started saying, so how do we actually get out there? One of the things in one of the questions later that Glenn's asked us about that I really wanted to, I was going to say it, but I think it's appropriate here, is the very first thing, and what I learned most, is we got to go to them, they're not coming to us. So when you think about a statewide leadership academy, you know, it's getting out where they are and meeting them and meeting their needs. It's not about us setting up some kind of, oh, here's a big PD by some well-known national person, come get all this great information, and we've done what we need to for you, because that did not. Those are nice things to do as a part of a support, but that's not where the work really happens. So through the work with Wallace, there were 3 things that we learned that probably hit me harder than anything else. First is cohesiveness, a cohesive leadership system. And that's what a statewide leadership academy should be. We did not have that. We had some different organizations that supported leadership work, but it was the only way they got to be a part of that is if they paid to be a part of it. So you guys know, especially in our state where so many small rural districts, some of those schools are lucky if they get a $200 allocation for leadership training. So they can even go to one meeting, because most of the meetings cost more than that if you drove into the state capitol, and all of them were either held in Frankfort or Lexington. So that didn't, or sometimes in Louisville, but that didn't really meet any of our needs. So then when we started again with some of the learnings from Wallace was scale and sustainability. how do we scale this? How do we say, okay, it'll work in one place, but that's not effective unless it can work every place? And how do we get that message out? So that's when I went searching for a vehicle. I didn't feel at that point in time we could just, as you guys really have the luxury of starting from scratch and creating one, I had to find something I could kind of piggyback onto or that I could help to mold into a statewide organization. So in our Kentucky Association of School Administrators, there was a program called the Kentucky Leadership Academy, but it was only for those districts who wanted to pay $1,000 a year to participate. And so again, we left a lot out. And again, they were just there either in Lexington, Louisville, or sometimes in Frankfurt having meetings. So through some resources and support from the Department of Education, we were able to partner and say, you have to open it up to everybody. We will give you some monies, but what we want is every district in this state represented, and we want to be able to make sure everybody gets the information. One of my lessons learned, later on we'll talk about that, but was that, again, I couldn't deliver it from just those 3 locations and think we'd done what we needed to. We later learned through holding, what was really ironic was we held town hall meetings to talk about how to redesign the university programs, what does the principals need, and we had, all stakeholders there. And what we heard was that it needed to be localized. They needed to have the training that supported their parts of the state. Very different. The kind of training that a principal needs for Louisville, but also that same person would be able to go to Western Kentucky or to Pikeville, Kentucky, which is another large district, but very rural, and be able to be a school principal. So we learned a lot about that, but one of the things that stuck with me was we got to go to them. We got to make sure we hear what they need, and that's what we have to work from. So, we wanted cohesiveness, and so this one vehicle offered to work with me to support and become something that would serve statewide. And we were able to open it up. We wanted everybody to be a part of it so that they all got the message. Everybody heard from the same information. They were all on the same page. And realized what we felt like effective leadership was and what we needed to do. And we wanted them to have life on the ground. We wanted to be where they were and really understand what was going on in the state.
Thank you, Debbie. Paul? So 2.5 years ago, we were asking ourselves the question, what's not working? What are we not doing right here? And we decided that we needed something done at scale. We needed a system, so we called it the Leadership Development System, and we started with the question, who right now in the state is involved in doing any kind of training for principals? And we put representatives from those groups on what we call the commission, our Leadership Development System Commission. So we had the Superintendents Association sitting on there, we had the Secondary Principals Association on there, the Elementary Principals Association. We had the folks who help train principals. They have an association as well, they were on there. We have regional centers like you do. They sat on there, and one of the seats was occupied by our department, but just one seat. Everyone else shared that, and we said if we're going to make this work at scale, we have to do this together. We can't do separate things. The next question we asked is, so if we're going to provide training at scale, what is it? What are we going to provide people? And how are we going to service all principals? Well, keep in mind we had some people studying to be a principal, some people who just got licensed and are our first year or second year principal, some who are 3 years plus, and some who are veterans and feel like they've kind of got a handle on all of it, and it had to touch all of them. So the curriculum we developed for this training was in 4 levels: aspiring, emerging, developing, and transformational. In other words, from aspiring to retiring, or aspiring to expiring, depending on how you look at it. But there was training at every single level. And then the next question was, well, how do you deliver it? And so we just submitted our state ESSA plan, as a lot of states have done, and within that is the opportunity to withhold funds and put it towards leadership development. And so we decided we would fund it that way. We spent from January to May on the road, running around the state and talking to superintendents across the state about the fact that we were going to withhold 3% of their funds. We targeted superintendents who were going to lose the most, and said not only did they recalculate at the federal level, so you're losing a lot, but we're going to keep a little bit too, and here's why, and here's what we want to do with it. We attended superintendent meetings where we had 40 or 50 sitting in a room, and we went through the whole thing again and said, we want to keep your money, but here's why. And we had not one single superintendent in the state not say, this is an idea worth having. This is an idea we should all get behind and do together. And then there was a but do it well. But be sure this is worth my principal's time. And that's why we spent so much time making sure the curriculum was right. And so we got $1 million out of that. And what's interesting about that, hindsight, looking back now, is what it is, it made partners of every single district in the state. So what we said to them is, this isn't the state's money, this is your money. We're already spending your money to provide leadership development for your principals. That has to work kind of in tandem with what you're doing locally, but you've already paid for it. And what that got was a huge amount of participation. We have districts now volunteering some of their best principals to be mentors to the first-year principal because they don't want this to fail because they're already paying for it. And so what we did with the $1 million is we hired leadership development specialists, and they're regionally based, much like you guys have in Georgia. We have regional centers, and so we housed them on regional centers, and they have one job, and that's to train the principals and assistant principals in their region using the content we all developed together. And so our ed and mid programs are working with the aspiring level content, and then they get their license and they work with the emerging level content, and then after that the developing level content, and then they finish with the transformational content. CCSSO helps sponsor us in writing that content, and so the content's free. It's on CCSSO's site, it's on our site. Penny and I have talked about it. It's free to any state who wants to use it and take it. I would tell you, don't waste time doing what we did, because we studied all kinds of models, we looked at all kinds of research. We surprisingly didn't find anything in there that was like, oh wow, we didn't know principals needed to know how to do this. It was things that we all kind of know. The research is pretty clear about what needs to happen. We just drop the ball when we do it, with fidelity, and we do it at scale. I think those are the two things we were missing, is at scale and with fidelity. So the content isn't the solution. What I've come to realize is that there's planning and then there's execution. And execution is the hard work, and it's the place where we drop the ball, and that's where we're at now. And so our numbers of principals we are working with this year is tripled, and we haven't even gotten into the developing level content yet. When we add those numbers in, we think they're going to really skyrocket. And that's what we're doing this year, is delivering that across the state. One of our regional laboratories, we're with REL out of Colorado, is doing the same for us. And so all the data that we get from our trainings and what our principals do with that training is shipped off to REL, and they study it for us and they give it back to us because we made an oath to our superintendents to not only do it but do it well. And so we will be doing reports to those folks on a regular basis saying, here's exactly what the data is telling us about how this is working.
So that's a little bit like a stockholder report, would you agree?
It is, and it costs me sleep. Just to tell you honestly, it's the thing I think about in the middle of the night is, what if the data's not looking right? But we're not going to do something right. Something's not going to be done right, and we just need to be honest about it up front and say, what we have to do is have a system that is flexible and can respond to what the data tells us. Not walk out the door with perfection and say, wow, we've got it figured out. But be honest about it and say, something is going to be off the mark. One of our regional people is not going to be as good as some of the other ones. We're going to have to do something about it. So we just have to be responsive and be really transparent with our stakeholders.
So Paul, in the policy studies report that I referenced earlier, the information about Missouri particularly identifies your leadership development system, and you're very specific that you've done this in phases. In other words, you didn't try to do it all at once. And so, as you pointed out, you're now working with those emerging participants. And I know, again, from conversations that you've got those other stages planned as well. So we appreciate what you're doing. And particularly, I appreciate your comment about the difference between planning and execution. And again, I know our panel of experts here are in very strong agreement on the difference between those two concepts. Perhaps that's why they are held up as good examples or good models for others to consider. So, Paul Fleming, let me direct a question toward you. So we heard Paul Cadney talk about some of the things they did in Missouri with their Title II funds. I know that you did something similar in Tennessee. Can you describe the what and the why?
Sure, and I think similar to Paul, Missouri, where it's just a really interesting parallel about how we structure training and at scale and the cohesive piece and the fidelity piece, and we wanted to put all that in the mix. So we really have two tracks. I described briefly our Governance Academy for School Leadership, called GASL for short, which is a terrible acronym, but that's what we call it. And that really does focus on those 25 assistant principals annually coming to Vanderbilt. And we realized in developing that program 3 years ago, we launched it 2 years ago, that there were 4 kind of evidence-based highly effective components that we put in place that then we then later scaled to a larger degree to push our 20 leader preparation programs on as well. So first, our Governance Academy has, what we have is the residency model for that, and that's flexible. So these assistant principals are spending 3 days a month in a mentor's building in their district. So in other words, they're partnered with a mentor. They are spending 3 days a month, and they get to pick those 3 days in a building in their district, but it's not their own building, to learn from a highly qualified mentor or principal. So they're matched with that, and that's the residency component, which is number 1. Number 2, then they're coming to Vanderbilt University from all over the state 1 weekend a month, Friday, Saturday. And Joe Murphy is actually one of the architects of our program at Vanderbilt. So that's the second piece around actually the content being aligned to our state and national leadership standards, because that's what they're being evaluated on. So it's only fair that they are learning those pieces in a highly effective way. So those 25 assistant principals come to Vanderbilt once a month. They are each placed with a highly effective mentor. They spend 3 days a month in that mentor's building doing kind of a problem practice. Third component is around what we call then bridge support. So once they finish the program and they're placed as a principal or leader, they need continued support. And so that GASL program, we provide continued ongoing professional learning for those folks once they go through the 12-month program. And then fourth, where we're still working on, is this idea of induction. Like Paul mentioned Missouri, for beginning leaders. How do we actually develop and keep them in their first 3 years trained and developed and feeling supported in their district and in the state? But those 4 pieces, the residency, the content alliance training, the bridge support, and then the induction. When we then developed our state plan, and then through our ESSA plan, we used the Title II 3% set aside, $1 million, to then fund 9 different regional pipeline models. So we are now trying to say at scale, and this is where I wanted to clarify earlier, we didn't have a licensure issue with our governance program, but we wanted to also push our 20 leader prep programs towards those 4 kind of non-negotiables, because a lot of them were not doing residencies. A lot of them were not doing training that was aligned to the standards. A lot of them were not providing support post-program. So this Transformational Leadership Alliance, and Dr. Bethel's been part of that, which we appreciate his leadership in Tennessee, is designed then to scale and to fund through the Title II 3% regional programs that fit the needs of districts, and they're required to partner together to get the funding. And we're going to train about 160 aspiring leaders through those 9 regional principal pipeline models under the umbrella of this Transformational Alliance. So the statewide alliance we're calling is like the incubator for these regional programs to begin, based on what we found through our Governor's Academy to kind of get to the scale piece. So we're really excited. We just funded those 9 regional programs. They're all different kinds of partnerships. We have one, they have 6 districts coming together, agreeing to train their aspiring folks, which if you think about it, districts coming together, they're often competitive. They know they might lose a candidate to another district, but they're committed to forming a partnership. We have 2 of our leader preparation programs being partners in one of these 9 models. So they're agreeing now to change their practices. And I think that's another key that Glenn and I have talked about is deciding on what are your scale, your non-negotiable items for leader training and leader development, and what are your flexible items that districts can truly have ownership on, and be very clear about the difference between those two. So that's where we are. We're excited about the launch of this Transformational Leadership Alliance with the 9 regional programs that are going to train about 160 folks.
I appreciate that, Paul, again. I think what we're seeing in Tennessee, again, is a varied approach, much like Debbie talked about. There's got to be cohesion. Sometimes we use the word framework, that there's got to be some kind of structure for that. A few words that I keep hearing over and over again are scale and sustainability. So if it works well in a big district, can I make it work well in a small district? If it works well in an urban area, can it work well in a rural area? If it works well in the Northwest, can it work well in the Southeast? I know that all of you have given a great deal of thought. We've had some great conversation, I think. But I know our committee is sitting out here on their hands because they've got questions they want to ask. So I want to shift just a little bit and open the floor and see what kind of questions they have, see if there are other areas that we need to probe in the time that remains. So, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and thank you. And after we go around of questions, then you may want to finish up the questions that we asked in the past program. I think we got some questions we'd like to ask. I'm going to start with Representative Sensible here. He's got a burning question.
How burning this is, but I appreciate that. It is something I was wanting to. I'll set this a little further from me here. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, it works right there.
Okay, sir, thank you. I'm trying to get great clarity on things. I think as you guys have, I mean, you're taking something that's as broad as this and trying to narrow it down to a few moments remarks. It's hard to get everything. And I think just for great clarity, I wanted to ask a question of Dr. Katnick specifically. And I appreciate your being very forthright about, this is something, this is a journey you've been on for 33 years. You're trying to get deeper and deeper, if you will, to the core of this onion to really kind of get to the essence of solving these issues. The step you're taking now to do this at scale, to think about those 4 different levels, as I was thinking about this myself, I was thinking about, before you're an assistant principal, while you're an assistant principal, before you're a head principal, maybe while you're a head, trying to move on to be a senior head principal. Those are kind of going through my mind as well before you lay it out, kind of these 4 different categories. But I guess to draw a fine point on the question, what form physically does that take? I mean, not to be too practical, but I mean, is this a residential program where people show up in the summer for a week at a university or at a place? And I know there's sort of that intense training, then there's the continuing training that you're talking about, Dr. Fleming. But what form does it specifically take now, or where you're going? What's it going to look like for us in terms of a week of this, a weekend of that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did very different this time is we spent a lot of time studying adult learning theory as a part of the materials. So not only are we teaching principals about the right things to do, but we're also spending a lot of time thinking about the fact that we're training principals. We're not training other people, and principals are a particular adult. They have a very fragmented, busy life, and you have to accommodate training to reach them in a way that they're going to actually apply. And so having given some thought to the learning theory, we paid attention, and it's in the materials, to delivery platforms. And so I mentioned some of the other associations that are involved. Some of the content and training happens through a statewide regional conference put on by our principal associations. Some of them happens between one-to-one mentoring, a person who comes to your building and walks your school with you and trains you that way. Some of them happens in regional cohorts. And so what we try to do is match the learning with the ideal delivery mechanism. And so those platforms are all laid out in the materials, and it'll say this particular training on this skill should take 45 minutes and is best delivered, at a state meeting or at a regional cohort meeting or one-to-one in the building. It specifies that. And our leadership specialists in the region are in charge of making sure it gets delivered through that platform. One of the things that the superintendents talked to me about very clearly was sometimes you take them out for 2 days and you train them somewhere. And then when they come back to the building's waiting for them. Sometimes it greets them in the parking lot. And what was good learning, when they did the evaluation when they left, they were like, this is great. By the time they get out of their car and make it into the office, that's gone. And so the chance of application happening goes way, way down. And so we had to think about when is an example of something that needs to be learned on-site in their building. And so we work with principals about mapping staff, knowing what the strengths of their staff is, knowing what the areas are that the staff needs to grow stronger in. And the best place to do that is walking the hallways of their school. So some training goes that route. Others, it's really great to deliver it like in a statewide conference where I can talk to a principal who lives 5 hours from where I live and is in a very different kind of school. So it's done through platforms, and it's based on adult learning theory. Does that help?
It does help. I guess my question is there any residential component to it at all, or is it really all contextualized in day training, Saturday training, or in the school?
There are regional cohorts, and so if I'm a principal in my first year, I'm a part of a cohort of other first-year principals that are in my region of the state, which is why we house those specialists in centers around the state, much like your map shows. We would have a person assigned to each of those regions who understand the context.
So you would go drive and, on a Saturday morning at 8:30, the training would start. There's a sort of a Saturday setting where that works, and then there's an in-the-school setting where that works.
But yeah, we haven't tried the Saturday.
Okay.
I'm not sure how lucky we would be with that. I'm just a big believer you have family, you have life outside of school, that sometimes school takes over your life. So we've been playing around with a 10 to 2 model, which says go on into school, get school running for the day, come to us at 10, we'll train you for a couple hours, we'll feed you, and we'll get you back to your school. Because we do it discrete skills at a time. We don't give them a whole bunch of things. We say, let's just talk about feedback for teachers today, and let's have you go back this afternoon or tomorrow and start using it right away. And let's have that specialist person check up on you to see, are you applying that skill that we just worked with you on? And keep in mind, they don't pay for it because we've already taken their money. So you show up, we feed you, we train you, and back you go to apply.
So the regional 10 to 2 things happening monthly? What's the?
We call them implementation windows, and so the window we're in now is a September 1 through Thanksgiving, and there are particular skills that we'll be working on with them in that window. It'll be maybe two days worth of training in that amount of time. Over the course for an emerging principal, over the course of their first 2 years, which is what our mentoring requirement is, so the emerging content is aligned to 2 years. It's about 17 days worth of training. A day or two might be about a national state conference. Several days might be on site with someone in the building with you. Several days would be in a regional cohort at someone's school or at a nearby university. The setting all depends on the region.
Dr. Fleming, I think, wanted to add.
Right. Thank you. Just to that question, I think we're seeing it similarly too with the regional cohorts. The aspiring folks and aspiring leaders really respond well when they have a cohort of folks at the same level. I know I was a former high school principal, and the isolation that often occurs. So I think that training element is really important. The challenge is when you go to the regional, we have regional centers of regional excellence, our core offices, like you have here, is you want to make sure they're all getting the same content in terms of that alignment. So you don't have this incredible regional center doing one piece here and it's not being duplicated. And I think, so it's both the opportunity to say you have these regional approach, which I think can be very good, but you want to make sure either from the governor or the state perspective that non-negotiable item is like the leadership standard of the content.
So you're concerned a little bit about the variation.
Right, exactly. And I think that's the only challenge when you go to a regional approach is how you maintain that.
So controlling for that variation.
Right. So we've spent a lot of upfront time this summer training those specialists, so they all have the exact same facilitation skills, and the content is locked in. So this implementation window from now to Thanksgiving, every principal is learning the exact same skills. They're all using the exact same content, the exact same evaluation forms. So we know that it's only going to be as good as the skill set of the specialist that delivers it.
Is that other questions?
I have a question.
answer this. What were some of the challenges when it comes to policy changes that had to happen from the district level, and not so much on the state level, but you're talking about the superintendent and the board, getting them on board and even looking at some of the policies that they might have had that were outdated or they had to come into conforming to with some of the things that you all would suggest?
You know, I can answer that. You know, I think I had written some words down as they were talking. There are just some key things that have to happen, both from the state level and from a district level. And the key word is you've got to develop relationships, partnerships, and have great communication. And I think from looking at it from a district's perspective, we've got to start realizing that when we produce, if a university is producing a principal, that district is their client. I mean, if the people aren't hiring after they go through my program, if they're not getting hired, my program will certainly soon shut down. So I think that that's part of it, is this constantly having conversations with the superintendent. I have a lot of conversations with HR directors because they really kind of are the talent managers for their district, and really talking about how they're going to have communication with their school boards, because we know that that's where policy is generated in school districts, and understanding the need in investing in leader development programs. And the school board really needs to understand, we can either pay up front in the development, or we're going to pay because we're going to be constantly retraining people because we're going to lose our talent because we're not retaining them. And I think it doesn't take school boards very long to understand that they'd much rather have that retention, because there's pretty clear research around schools, and when you lose a talented principal, what it takes to recover, because that whole first year, sometimes 2 years, depending on the climate in that school, is developing that trust level to do the hard work you have to do. So we have found that our greatest partners are superintendents, HR directors, and we even work real closely with some school boards in understanding that this is a good investment. And you know, it's really important. I do want to respond also. Did I answer your question first off? Okay. To that question about residency, because I thought that was a really great question. And I think what you mean is, can a person just spend their time learning how to be a principal full-time? Like, you know, sometimes we have student teaching. You know, as teachers, when you're in a program, a teacher ed program at a university, our teachers have 12, 15, we're increasing that amount. Some of them are doing year-long residencies now, fifth-year programs, because this is hard work we do. And we tested, because we had some funding through Race to the Top, a program in our state where people could apply to be an aspiring program, and they could take a year off from teaching and spend a full year in a residency program under the leadership of a mentoring principal. The problem with that, it is wonderful, but the problem is it's expensive. It was costing about $150,000 per principal. And I don't know many districts that have that kind of money for a principal that you don't have a guarantee they're going to stay. So what we did, and we have an alternative route, what we call an alternative route principal preparation program in our center, because we thought we could do a good job preparing principals, is that we try to keep the cost as low as we can, so that people who are paying their own way, but also if districts want to, through their succession planning that we encourage, they want to sponsor 2 or 3 people to get their certification, their training program, which is pretty much an 18-month training program. They'll end up with their assistant principal certificate. Then it's affordable, and districts can actually say, we're going to invest in this person, we're going to pay their salary for a year, and so their clinical hours, and we have over 1,000 clinical hours required, the district can actually pay their salary. And we do have, actually, believe it or not, some districts that have a little more money that actually sponsor someone in our program every year and pay their salary, because they're investing in this person, because that person stays and will go into their, stay with their school system.
I was just saying, I wasn't thinking a year, I was thinking a week or two.
Oh, okay. Okay, I always think, yeah, okay.
Senator Tibbetts, do you have a question?
No, I'll defer.
Senator Sands.
First of all, thank you all so much for coming. You've given us some really, really great information.
Thank you.
And just really pleased to be able to listen to a lot of this and internalize it, and hope that And we've done this in the state of Georgia years ago, but we kind of got away from it. And so getting away from it, I think that we've incurred a lot of problems that we could have avoided had we had well-trained leaders. But speaking from a rural perspective, because most of my district is very poor and very rural, I think Dr. Debbie said you have to go to them because they're not coming to you. And we find that to be extremely factual because most of them are suspicious of government, period. They don't want anybody in their buildings. They don't want anybody telling them what to do. I'm banished from a lot of my school districts because when they see me coming, they go, what does she want now? They don't understand that we're just there to help. We're not there to, you gotta critique, but we're there to help, and they don't understand that. So how do you change that mindset, that culture of laissez-faire? Just leave us alone, we don't want to be bothered.
One of the things that I learned early on was that you've got to have both. You've got to have, and they talked about that consistent message, somebody from the state level that's ensuring that every region or every place you go, the same message is getting out. But here's the critical piece that you're thinking about. You have to partner with somebody locally. Some principal who's had a lot of success, some district, and you take those folks with you to share their story, to help to back up and support what they're hearing at a state level, to see that it really can happen or it is happening in certain places in their areas. So one of the things we always did was when we would go out to the different regions to provide the support and the training, is we always had local folks, local principals who would alongside us say, we've tried this in our school, either it worked or it didn't, but they get a local perspective and they hear it from their colleagues, and so that they know it's not just something that's done someplace else and it isn't done here. And I think that really makes a difference when you get those folks locally who can also be a part of your message and get it out for you.
I think there's an acknowledgement too that we need to make, and that's, it would be great if we could push pause on schooling and say, we're going to train your principal and then we'll unpause and let schooling happen again, but it doesn't. Schooling continues and it's happening in real time, and we have to acknowledge the fact that these principals are trying to run schools at the very same time that we're trying to train them. And so that whole delivery method that we were talking about says, I understand that you have schools to run while we're trying to help you be a better principal doing that.
I think one thing too, the communication piece you mentioned was important. So in Tennessee, when we set up this application for these regional pipeline models for folks to apply, we define it as we will give priority to high need districts, but we didn't say high need as urban. In other words, sometimes people hear high need or priority and just think it's, oh, this is only for the urban districts, and so we can't even do that. We were very intentional that this was a priority for rural districts as well. And I think just hearing that and then coming from the state level, that helped a lot of our smaller districts realize that this is a partnership. It's not a, it's not the state coming in and telling us what to do, because defining high need is rural.
I want to emphasize partnership. We had, our center did a lot of work where we were doing a lot of professional learning, and we would regionalize it and we would have them come to us. But we have learned from our experience over a number of years of running this center that partnerships really are better because it is a district and the center developing, customizing that professional development based on need. So I want to use an example of a rural. We have a very small rural. It is the poorest district. It is the lowest performing in our state. They have one high school, one middle school, and 2 elementary schools. They came to me about a partnership, and they had limited money. But because we get some state funds, I always feel like I need to give that money back. So we put some state funds with it. And what we did is we developed a partnership. In our 3rd year, we are working with our leaders, training the leaders, but coaching the leaders. We're also taking the other side of our center, which is content coaching for teachers. And we're in there and we're doing professional development, coaching, and development of leaders. about what happens after PD ends and what is the role of the principal. Because as Paul says, you're on the job every day. It doesn't go away even though you're out getting trained. This district is the fastest improving district in the state right now. And yesterday I was in a meeting with our U.S. Senator Tom Carper and last week with the governor. Think about the power when a small rural district in your state, the lowest performing, now is the fastest to close the gap. Because the reason I had the meeting was, is this a model that can be replicable in our urban school districts? And so what we're trying to say is, it's high quality, research-based professional learning for principals who are asked to lead these schools, not testing out ideas. Our kids are too valuable for us to try things that we know don't work. And so we do a lot of investment in training our teachers, but the key I think you're hearing here is that through our centers, we're really focused on those teacher leaders who are moving to assistant principals, and we even work with their district leadership staff because we believe if you don't work with the district leaders, they are the support system for the principal. And we believe if you forget that piece, that you can still have situations where principals can't thrive.
Bethel, before we run out of time, I got one crucial question I need to ask, and this may sound like how far is up, but do the best you can with it. First of all, I'm not thinking of anything at the moment in terms of budget or staffing, but first of all, let's speak about staffing. What would you, or what do you see, and use your own to respond if you like, but what do you see as the staffing or leadership-wide academy? And then what do you see in terms of the budget? And I'm thinking about, you've obviously got to have some people who are going to have standards and curriculum. People got to handle that. Then if you're going to localize it to regions, you have to have regional or leadership specialists around the state. And quite frankly, if you remember the map we saw where if we were addressing the low performance schools, there are specific regions or areas where we would need somebody. And then the other type of people that you would want to, as you speak of the platform, maybe you just need a good mentor for somebody in a particular area. So what does all that run in terms of numbers, of like full-time staff, part-time staff? And then next, that almighty gold thing of the dollar. What is an investment in that? And I refer to it as an investment because I really think that's what it is. Maybe a quick comment from each of you on that would be very helpful.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I've been running a center now for about 12 years, and I know all money's soft money, so I always treat it all as soft. So I don't ever plan that that money's going to be there. So let's just say that the state came in and gave me $1 million. Next year, the situation can change. So what I caution you is to not get top heavy with too many people, okay? To be smart and strategic. That's why in our state they partnered with the university. Having good, and I'm not saying it has to be a university. There's lots of partners, but we have a director, that's me. And my salary's paid two ways. Some through the revenue that we generate through partnerships, some through the state funding, but also through the university because I also teach. So you really get me a lot cheaper because the university's putting some dollars into it. The other thing is getting people who have a variety of experiences. We have found that we can hire retired administrators who are young and have another 15 years they want to work in our state. You know, they already have their benefits covered, so it doesn't cost for the benefits, so that saves money. And we have a cadre of people we train that are part-time people. That keeps the cost down because they don't need to work full-time. You know, you're using them for very specific things, and so being able to have some part-time people that you can deploy, you know, we bring them together because we train our staff as well. But to try to keep staffing so that you don't just bulk up because you want that money to stretch so that you can touch more districts.
I understand, but be a little bit more definitive if you can. Give us some numbers there.
So in our state, now remember we're small, so you just have to, so in Delaware, we We have $190,000 that comes to the university. It's a pass-through grant from the state legislature to do work with school leaders. And our center works in all 19 school districts and half of the charter schools with that $190,000.
Okay.
Now,
But you also.
but we generate,
fees.
so there's a fee for service. So we don't give it, we used to give it for free. And then Wallace asked me to read the book called Free, and it's like the cell phone. I'll give you the phone for free, but you gotta pay for the service. So we say, and I've learned this, if you give everything free, they don't show.
Gotta be some skin.
Skin in the game. Gotta have some skin. So we keep the cost down.
Okay. The two, Dr. Paul Fleming and Dr. Paul Katnick, your view on that as well as Dr. Daniel.
Good, sure. Yeah, so we were fortunate, our governor 3 years ago dedicated about $500,000 in recurring funds through the legislature for this Governor's Academy for School Leadership to be developed. And that was the beginning, and we're proud to say we're actually under budget every year. We spend about $350 to $400K on that training program I mentioned for our 25 assistant principals. We have one program director on my team. We have the content provider, which in this case is Vanderbilt University, because of Joe Murphy and others that provide the content and the training for those monthly, as you mentioned, those monthly modules that the assistant principals get. We also then have the mentors in the districts who are also getting a small stipend to be the mentor, but it's pretty modest because they're also, we believe, getting professional learning, as well. So for all of that, that's because of the governor's leadership, we were able to use and actually come in under budget every year for that money, if that makes sense for this.
So all those people are paid with the $500,000?
Right, exactly. With that, and that includes
Developing the module.
Yeah, exactly, because both the content development and the content provider are one and the same, being a university, and then also the site, so all of that's wrapped together. And then a lot of that training, I think, as Paul mentioned, in Missouri, are then happening in the districts because the mentors are working and training those folks. So I think that's been effective and lean in a way that's helpful too.
You want to keep it lean as much as you can.
Yeah.
So we have 9 specialists that are around the state. They're coordinated by one FTE of the department who does this as their work. Our year 1 and year 2 principals each have their own mentor. So that's over 100 people across the state who serve as a one-to-one mentor. And then we have different committees working on different projects. To this lady's question here about policy, they're working on policy-related issues. One of them is redoing the language of our administrative certificate to embed the competencies of this in there. We're also putting it in the school accountability system and in the scoring guide and in the ESSA plan. And so there's committees, we feed them lunch, we bring them in, feed them lunch to do that work. So there's 100 or so people working on different committees related to different areas. The funding that covers that is $900,000 of the district money to pay our specialists. The remaining $100,000 of that 3% set aside plus a couple $100,000 of the state's set aside money covers all of that work.
Okay. So at 1.2 million, something like that?
Yes, sir. That's about right.
And I also mentioned we have that $1 million on the Title II 3% set aside to fund these 9 regional pipelines separate from the governor's academy. So we kind of have 2 funding streams.
Yeah, so there's not a lot of difference between the 2 numbers that you all gave. I thought you didn't feed them very well if you were doing all the
That's why we have that million. And hopefully it's similar in Georgia. I don't know what the 3% number is, but hopefully it's something.
Ours was around 500,000. Part of that came from about 150 or so from the Department of Education, which helped to just contribute to what the Leadership Academy was already generating through membership fees and so forth. And then they, we did have some grants, and anytime we could find something to apply for, we did. But the staff there, and it worked very well, was the one director, we had 1 staff assistant, we had 8 consultants, which were all part-time, and there was 1 for each region that we worked in. And then what really helped out, though, was 2 things. We always partnered with KDE staff who were already on salary, and so this was just part of their job, is that they were to work in collaboration with our consultants to deliver. And then we also had our district partners. So, superintendents would allow principals to help with some of the training, especially if they had expertise or their school had done something that, really needed to be recognized and that they could share with everybody else. So part of those consultants' jobs were to find out what was local, who locally could partner with them to do the training. So really you're looking at a staff of 10, maybe a dozen if you added a couple other part-time assistants to help run copies and get things ready for some of the meetings and that sort of thing. So about $500,000 a year to run that program. We always too, you talk about lunch and so forth. Lots of times we met in schools where we didn't have to pay for a meeting room. And we're real cheap. We ate out in the lunchrooms, or we brought in pizzas, which, were cheap. But everybody was okay with that, and they realized we're there to get this training. And again, it was on that 10 to 2 timeline. But what really brought a lot of them in, and something we haven't really talked about very much, is that this training always included one of those non-negotiables that Glenn asked us about, was there has to be something just in time. What's going on as far as reports due to the state, monies that's got to be spent, time to start working on your budgets, looking at predictions for staff for next year, but something just in time that really would draw them away from those hours out of their building to be able to say, this is important to me and it's going to help me when I go back to do a better job, so that you had some kind of an incentive for them to come and get something that was going to be immediately helpful to them and what they needed.
As Alvin would say, it's a precarious position to be in, standing between hungry people at lunch. I'll try to be brief. I want to ask a question, and I realize that you probably cannot answer it in the amount of time we have, so I'd like to ask you, I want to pose the question to you and ask you if you would jot down your thoughts on it and send them to Glenn, and maybe he could distribute them back to the committee. A little bit of the context that we're in, and I think it may be somewhat unique that you have operated in your own states. A couple of years ago, we had a constitutional amendment to have an opportunity school district that was patterned after the recovery school district in Louisiana. That amendment failed. Last year in the legislative session, we had a House Bill 338. It was a turnaround school bill. The major difference was this is an intervention bill to come in, because so many times that we heard from the districts that said, you don't understand our problems, you're going to come in and take over the school, but are you going to have the people that can straighten the school out either, or are you going to farm it out, or what are you going to do, which I think are very valid questions. My question to you is, given that context and the commitment that we made to go in and help districts, not saying that the state would never take over schools, but that would certainly be the last resort. Our first choice would be to work with existing leadership, acknowledging full well some of the leadership in the schools may not know how to handle the challenges they face. Are the challenges in these lowest performing schools a different set of challenges from what you would normally face in a school? And when we talk about a principal pipeline program, I believe that you have to plan for the future. But I think the position that we're in, the bill specifically said that we would give specific attention to the low performing school. And this whole initiative of the Leadership Academy would be working in conjunction with the Chief Turnaround Officer and that office.
I can quickly give an answer.
Let me ask you, if you give a written answer, I'd like for you to deal with 2 or 3 issues. Do you feel like people serving as adjunct professors who have the experience of turning around a school are the most effective way to go? How effective is distance learning or Skype to cut out the amount of windshield time that's involved in going to a location for training? Thirdly, and especially in Delaware, you talked about the evaluation of the universities and what the programs that were currently coming out of them and why this is not sufficient. Offline, I'd like for you to also send us your evaluation of the university delivery of leadership and teachers, and if there is a disconnect, how do you know there's a disconnect, and how do you know what it is? I think so many times in all of our industry, we see the disconnect between a specific program and what the needs of the job place really are. If y'all could answer those, and if you were in our situation, under the timeline that we're in, to try to design a leadership academy specifically or with emphasis on the lowest performing schools, how would you go about it? And if you could draft those just an answer, it doesn't have to be formal. It can be on a yellow legal pad, handwritten if you want to do it. That's fine. Glenn can get it transcribed.
So y'all work with me.
Yeah, we'll work with you on that, sure.
Thank you. But you had an answer, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think leadership academies evolve over time. We work with 14 of our lowest performing schools in the state because we receive state funds. And so we do exactly what you say. The state says that state funds should be spent in the lowest performing schools. So part of our partnerships with, some of them are urban, some are rural. The example I gave earlier is one of our priority schools. It's a middle school that's making real gains, and we have to go in there and do real professional development, technical assistance, and project management with those schools because there's a sense of urgency. But I think different academies operate for different missions. Part of ours is school improvement. It's a large part of what we do.
Well, we're talking about 100 plus schools
Yeah,
because the list varies from 120 to 160. The bill last year, I think, clarified it down to the lowest 5%, so it would be in line with federal numbers. And so, but, you know, we've got 2,200 and something schools in the state, so you do the math, you know how many schools we're talking about. It's got to, obviously, it's got to be scalable, and we're the largest state east of the Mississippi River, so geographically it's challenging.
Really is
If this was your problem, how would you solve it? What suggestions would you make for us based on your experience?
So Senator Tibbins, you know that we agree that that's a wonderfully focused, directed question. And I think you have asked some of the best people that you could possibly find. So I'll work very closely with colleagues here. Again, we know that the response or the answers is central to the work of this study committee. So, any other questions from committee members? I know, as you pointed out, Senator Tippins, we're dangerously close to.
I'll point out I did mine before 12 o'clock.
Yes, sir.
How long you
Yes, sir. So we're getting dangerously close, but very quickly, our colleagues, again, and how much I respect you and appreciate you being here, but they're going to stay with us for lunch. So I would encourage you to, pick their brain, because they got some really good stuff in their brains. I know that. But use that as an opportunity to talk with them and glean. Paul, I know Dr. Katnick, we got to get you out here a little bit earlier so that you can make your flight, but I'll make sure we get you out on time, okay? So, Will?
Dr. Bethel, Alvin told me to keep my mouth shut today and not say anything, but you know that wasn't going to be possible. Number one,
It didn't work.
It didn't work. As a fiscal conservative, I think it's amazing what you're pulling off with almost no funding. But Martha Ann, what I would say in Georgia, if we're going to do it, and if we're going to spend somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion on education, let's make the right investment in leadership. It all rises, it all falls on leadership. In terms of what you've discussed, in terms of some of it is central, you've got to go to them, some of it, we've already got an organization in place, and we probably need to be thinking fiscally about how we more efficiently use what we already have, and I'm thinking the REISs. If we send $12.5 million a year out to REISs and then 180 districts also pay fees, I can only speak for one superintendent in Pioneer REISA, but a significant percentage of that REISA money going towards leadership development would certainly be another avenue to fund this at a really substantial level, other than also using a percentage of the Title II funds, which I'd also support in terms of what I've heard. By the way, I think our Title II is probably about twice what Tennessee is in the state of Georgia. And then finally, Secondly, in terms of what you're going to teach and not reinventing the wheel, and I heard at least two of you discuss this, we got a little bit of money from Race to the Top 2 several years ago. And in my humble opinion, one of the few takeaways that we got was really high quality evaluation instruments, both for teachers and for leaders. And if we don't start in terms of using leader keys as what we think is important for principals to know, then we have missed the boat. I would love to get you four back, and Glenn, you won't do it. But Gwinnett County has done this for 25, 30 years. They've done it well. They are a school district that has more students than the state of Delaware. I would love to get Gwinnett County and you four at a panel when we start talking about here's what we want to do and what does that look like. But if we're going to do this, let's do it. Let's fund it well. We've got some vehicles, $1 million to provide leadership for a pipeline of principals in Georgia. Let's just go back home and have a nice lunch. And if we're going to do that, let's not reinvent the wheel. We've got leader keys. And leader keys is the right stuff. Now let's create some modules and some consistency, and let's decide how we're going to deliver that. Let's use some vehicles that are already in place. RISA, we can do a lot of asbestos training, or we can say, you know what, maybe it is important for us to fund leadership training and put those resources in our RISAs around the state, and let's do it right.
Representative Saxler, and then
Then
we're going to eat.
I guess I'll take up for what the good superintendent said. I asked the question, you know, if we were within reason, if resources weren't a constraint from a financial standpoint, and if we looked at what the choke point was, if the choke point in the system was the availability of principal time, we talked about 10 to 2, how much time can they really pull out of their buildings? If that became the constraint, and we spend way more than $1 billion a year as a state on K-12, you know, and to leverage this leadership, I think that the dollars that are in play here would not, with the focus we've got as a state, it's not, oh, can we get a 1.2 million from 500,000? I think it's an order of magnitude higher than that in terms of potential. If we had the resources, what would the program look like such that the constraint was we can't overburden the principals who are involved in this? What are the dollars we'd be talking about then? Because again, we talk about the monies that are going to RISAs, you know, a lot of this is leadership. I don't know that the constraint would be dollars. What is the ideal program delivery? That's the question. I'll just kind of leave you with it and talk about everything.
I think if I could just echo very quickly, both those points are powerful because too often I think we see funding driving the planning rather than planning driving the funding. And so I would urge the council to think about what's the vision for this academy and then let that vision drive both the planning and then the funding, because that backward design, I think you both mentioned, is powerful. But we often start with the funding and then we try to fill in the gaps, and then you get the variation.
I'm also concerned that we continue to give money to agencies in the state, large sums of money that have not necessarily delivered on things that they were supposed to have done. And we have to be very, very, very careful about that. And those agencies need to be assessed before we say, we're going to give you another pile of money and hopefully you can get it right this time. Especially in the rural areas of the state, where money has been given to these agencies, and there's still another fee on top of a fee, although we continue to give these agencies, and especially the RISAs, millions of dollars every year. And we've not seen the results that we should have seen based on the data and other things. So I think that's something that we have to look at too. We may need to just start with something totally different because the mindset of these organizations have not changed over the years. So I'm really concerned about that. Especially in my rural areas of the state, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just going to say you're correct, and that's why we're here.
Yes, sir.
To recommend that. Okay, is there a burning question you just got to answer before we eat? Okay. Let's adjourn and we will eat, and hopefully we can have some conversation.
This Chairman Will Banks, again, for the benefit of everyone who's in the room. I can't think of a better group as a group. I can't think, if I had to bring just one, I can't think of any, I couldn't pick one out of the four. But again, they walk the walk, they talk the talk, and again, we are deeply, deeply indebted for your time and your energy, but more importantly, for your passion for what is right for all kids. So again, panel members, we appreciate you so much.
Folks, I hate to break up good conversation, but we do need to start back. And I have asked one of the panel members, and I decided not to ask the others because I really liked his answer, and the other three don't like it, then we wouldn't do it. But he said he would be glad to, if there are any lingering questions while they're here, they have to catch a van about 1:30, and they need to get down and find it. So we may have at least 20 minutes here while they could be in the room with us. And then that would be time to go by the facilities as well. So if there are any questions that any of you have of the panel members while they're here, I'm sure they would at least Dr. Fleming committed you all to doing that, so.
Thank you.
I think it's because his academy's Gazzle and mine's Dazzle.
Yeah.
He thinks we're cousins. I think about that all the time.
We all love the term turnaround principle, and I haven't found anybody who can define it very well. Have you had a challenge coming to consensus on what a turnaround principle can do and what they look like?
You know, someone was asking me that the other day about turnarounds. We're working at about 14 turnaround schools in our state, and I said, you know, if I knew the magic formula for turning around a low-performing school, I could make $1 million. And I think it's so context-driven. I mean, I think turnaround is about running a school efficiently and effectively, having the right team together and focusing on the right work. And it's very context-driven. So what I would need to do in a rural school in my state and what I have to do in the urban school may be a little different, but there are some things that I think are just givens. I mean, some of the things that we have not done very well is prepare our principals for the importance of what they have to do in doing what we kind of call pastoral care of children, which is working with our communities much more, because that's very time intensive. You're so busy managing that school and trying to work with your teachers, but there's schools that are not performing, there's a disconnect between how the family support. So that takes a lot of time. But it's also having principals who really know instruction. I had 18 years of teaching before I became a principal. 18 years. I was a reading specialist. I knew instruction. I knew assessment. I knew curriculum. I could sit across from a teacher who wasn't teaching appropriately and actually give that teacher actionable feedback about how to improve. When we have principals who haven't learned good instruction, sometimes they have a hard time giving actionable feedback. And we were just talking here about it's also very hard. Sometimes our principals struggle being able to deliver the message that what's going on in this classroom is good. And being able to say that courageously, look someone in the eye and say, I'm putting you on an improvement plan because you're harming children. So I think there's a lot of factors about school turnaround, but we have to prepare principals to understand that these are going to be things they're going to be faced with. They're not always going to be in a school where every kid comes to school ready to learn and has every teacher that's day one ready. So, but it is the magic question.
And you have to have district personnel and the hiring, I'm talking about working with HR, that understand the kind of person that you need to go into that school. Because a lot of low-performing schools, the culture is very toxic. These are the schools where the teachers nobody wanted all got put in that one school. So when you get that person in there, they've got to make right off the bat some tough choices. And it's a situation where there has to be some immediate action, some immediate turnaround. You can't sit on it for a year and wait to find out, should I fire this person or should I make a move from one grade to another, whatever you feel like you need to do. Because the question that person has to always ask themselves is, I've got 30 kids sitting in that classroom. And that principal has to decide, I have to do what's best for those kids, and sometimes that's not what's best for the adult. But they have to be willing to make those kind of decisions, and not every person, and in a different situation, some other person might be a great principal, but in a situation like that, in a low-performing, high toxic culture school, where those are the decisions that right off the bat have to be made. If you don't get the right people in the rooms to teach those kids, you're not going to get anything done. So you're not going to go in and we all go in wanting to be loved and say, oh, I'm going to hug every one of them, I'm going to do my best, I'm going to show them how much I care. It's tough love because you've got to do what's right for those kids. And not everybody has what it takes to do that. So district people have to understand and recognize the skills and talents of their talent pool and know who's the right person to put in that building.
I would just add quickly, I think a lot of the research shows that the elements and the training that works for all principals also works in a turnaround setting is the time difference, right? That there's the speed at which some of those decisions have to happen, but it's one big bucket around instructional expertise and principals really knowing what high quality instruction looks like and having those courageous conversations so teachers accountable. And then second, the school culture piece. So I know Joe Murphy Vanderbilt likes to talk about, got to keep one eyeball on high expectations and academic rigor, and one eye on school culture. And if you take care of those and you train to those two big areas, it works across the board. It's just a turnaround. It's got to happen faster.
Question here. Just really quickly before you go. We have a real practical situation in that we're in a down year this year. Since we submitted our ESSA plan, we aren't recommending any schools this year. But a year from now, we'll have 60 or 70 that are going to be identified as the principal in charge of that. Our emerging level and developing level has nearly 70 different learning experiences in it that teach different leadership skills. And the quick answer would be, these principals need all of them, but you can't give them all of them. So what we're going to spend this year doing is studying, of the 70, which ones are the most urgent targeted ones, and we're going to triangulate that study. One of them is going to be from our leadership specialists, what they think they need. One of them from a committee we put together just to study this. And then we have a pilot group of 15 principals from the old SIG, old school improvement process, that we're working with this year to test them out. And between those three groups, we hope to raise up 10 or 12 different experiences to say this is going to be our curriculum for turnaround principals. And we want to test it this year, and then next fall, when we identify 60 or 70 principals, that's what they're going to get. But we're going to have spent a year studying it. So we'll see what we get. You and I could probably come up with a list of what we think it's going to be, but I think it's worth the time to triangulate it against different audiences and test it out with principals who are running those kinds of schools now.
But I think we all know that if we prepare our principals in all the right stuff we know that the research says, we don't have conditions in that district to support that principal, and making sure that that district office is supporting them. If you have, if I'm going in there and trying to do real change and everybody's complaining about what Jackie's doing, they're running out, they're calling their school board members, they're calling the superintendent, they're talking to the mayor, they're talking to everybody, which happens. I've got to have a district office that's supporting me, so that's why it's really important to turn around that at the same time we're really developing these really great principals who know what they need to do and are willing to do it. But they have a support system there from that district leadership who's going to, have their back. Because that you're asking these, and I don't know what you have here, but contracts for principals. In my state, principals have year-to-year contracts. They have they don't have a union, they don't have anything to protect them. They have some districts may have an agreement with their boards to give them 2 years if they're highly effective. But, you're asking people to really go out on a limb to do the kind of change work we want them to do, and they have no guarantee if they make too much noise that they're going to be there next year.
That's where the state provides sometimes some coverage, so to speak, a little bit better.
Right.
To say, so we had it in Memphis, Shelby, our largest urban district. We gave that permission so that in those turnaround schools, the principals could hire only effective or highly effective. So they didn't just replace everybody, but the expectation was, according to our statewide evaluation system, you have to be, as a teacher, be either effective or highly effective to teach in that turnaround setting. And that was like the cover, so to speak, that the state gave that district for the position. And they saw tremendous gains because of that.
Sorry, Andrew.
Oh, that's right. It kind of piggybacks on some of that, what you're saying. And I don't know that there's an exact answer, but how long does it take for a turnaround principal to get really in their stride? How long can they maintain that pace? What do you do as a district to support and prevent burnout in that position? And who is supervising these turnaround principals back in the districts, I guess is a lot of question.
The research on school turnaround is that really to turn around a local performing school, it really takes about 5 years to really put the structures in place so there's some sustainability. We don't give turnaround principals that long. If we don't see a change within a year to 2 years, we're moving them out. And we're bringing in principals with much less experience to do the hardest work in our state. I don't understand it. You do it in my state, I'm sure you do it here. Because you really do need an experienced leader who's willing to go into those school districts to build that. It takes a year to build the trust of that team. And sometimes, I don't know what your rules are in your state, but sometimes 50% of the staff's new in these schools. They fire 50% of the teachers and they got all new teachers. So you got teachers there who were moved there, who don't want to be there. So that's going to take that leader some time to develop a team to kind of do an assessment of the skill set. So we've got to, and I know there's a sense of urgency, we would hope to start seeing some progress in some different areas here. I would think by year 3 you're starting to see some real trends. But for me to really be able to get that school where it needs to be, and the data's pretty clear on that. If you looked at any of the reports that come out on school turnaround, I did a few reports on school turnaround through the Race to the Top, and it's pretty clear that we weren't really successful with some of the models that we created. You can blow it up and hope it all falls back together again, but it doesn't always.
So if what you're saying is true, and if the average principal only lasts 3 years, then should we be talking about turnaround teams where a principal can take in an associate principal, and you may increase your chances of some consistency for 5 years dramatically?
Well, I think that's really important. I'll tell you right now, I don't know any one person who does this by themselves, and I would suspect most of you would agree. Principals got to be able to distribute leadership out and build that team, having a strong assistant principal. Looking at some high schools, I think that in Cleveland, the superintendent there in a very urban school district is doing high schools 2 co-principals, strong in 2 different areas, and is getting some good results there. And then building a cohort of teacher leaders. They're actually helping lead that school and building that capacity. Eric Gordon is the superintendent in
Cleveland, Ohio.
Cleveland, Ohio. I think he's actually the national superintendent, urban superintendent of the year. Just phenomenal. I think you've been for Eric speaks some of the wildest things. But he's doing some really testing some things. He's putting all his money, if he's a gambler, on talent management in his district.
We don't do a good job of looking at markers. I mean, what we do is we look after a year or 2, and if they're not all proficient, we say they failed.
Yes.
Instead of saying, well, that's going to happen out of year 5, what were the things we see year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and if we're hitting the markers along the way, then there's a good chance that we will see some changes students out here. But we don't identify the markers up front and measure them and talk about them. We just look for proficiency rates.
And I was just going to say, I'd like us to see that we have a culture of decency and respect in the school year 1. We're using responsive classroom in a lot of our turnaround schools to talk about the power of words. How do we talk to children? How do we talk to one another? How do principals and assistant principals talk to each other? Learning how we build an atmosphere of respect and with one another, starting there. Because in some of these schools that I walk through, it's not a very respectful environment. I don't know how any teaching and learning can take place. So we say you have to build that culture. Then you can really begin to focus on some of the hard change that needs to happen. I'm sorry.
Representative, go ahead.
just going to say that another piece, back to something Jackie mentioned, was the leadership team, that you don't do it by yourself. If you don't have in a low performance school, in all schools, but particularly in the low performance schools, that team around that principal, when that principal does leave, what you see time and time again, because I know one of the studies we did in Kentucky was looking at these low performance schools. How many times have we sent highly skilled educator specialists into those schools? And while they did some good things and helped to start the turnaround on that school, as soon as they pulled out, things just went back like they were. So that principal has got to build a strong team around them that's on board, doing the same things, has the same vision for that school, so that things do not just go by the wayside, that they will continue when one person pulls out.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and Representative Sexton.
This may fall in the category of not nice, but it's not nice to adults. It's good for kids, so I'm going to ask the question. To what extent can we or should a leadership academy make very hard decisions about, is this person ever going to be a great leader? I mean, I ask that question because it's the presupposition in all this is that, you know, by a series of inputs, they can become very competent, and there's some tasks that can happen. If we ask this very sober, difficult question, I'm sure there's research around what a great principal education system can do and has the potential to do. But I think that presupposes the people that are being given to us by the districts are really great candidates to build that process. And I ask that question to you: to what extent can the system deliver great principals? And the second question is, I guess parenthetically, the more important question: should a leadership academy not be a very tough cut that maybe you only have a 60% graduation rate? Now think about, we were talking earlier about the military education system. There are leadership programs in the military where 50 to 60% of the people graduate. And that's the expectation. The people that don't graduate are not failures. They just get to say, this is a very tough cut. And I think we've got to be honest with ourselves that there's some number larger than 10% of principals that are going into our program. Maybe there will never be high-performing principals. And should this Leadership Academy not be a statewide way to say, you know what, you're not going to make it. We know they love you back home. We know your superintendent likes you. I mean, but you're just not going to be a principal in the state of Georgia. Is the Leadership Academy, should it have that charge? And to what extent do we know, can we assess early on this person will never be a high-performing person?
So all of us want to say yes. All of us that have been doing this say yes.
There's two things you'll have to have, I think. One is a structure that says I can look at discrete performances. So all of our leadership efforts for 30 years has been based on standards, which are aspirational statements. Very difficult to see how people hit aspirational statements. So our content is down a level lower at a competency level, where it's a specific skill that we can see whether you can do it or not. So that's the first thing we need, and then the second thing we need is the tools. You have to be courageous enough to say, unless you can demonstrate these skills to this level, you don't need to be running schools.
My wife's granddaddy was the school board chairman of a school district in Tennessee. And he made his daughter the principal of the only high school in that county. And I know her, I've known her for 25 years. I don't think she was a great principal. I'm not looking at data. So I look at that, and that's years ago. I look at that and I think, something's wrong in this picture. And how do we sort of interdict that? Because all the local politics were right for her to take that job, but something wasn't right in the system.
Yeah, and I think for us, practically with our Governor's Academy, to Paul's point of your question, about 40% of the candidates are accepted that apply. We also have multiple measures on the selection criteria, so it's not just who the superintendent recommends, although they do get to recommend candidates, but it's a recommendation, it's not a guarantee. And then there's actual kind of tasks around competencies to determine and assess during the interview process, case studies, mini scenarios, to determine kind of their aptitude on the front end before they're allowed into the academy.
Yeah, but you have an academy that's more of a lead thing. I'm talking about if in the totality of what it takes to become a principal, if there's a gate. I mean, we as a nation between the Civil War and World War II, stopped letting local states train their officers. You had to go through a federalized basic training, officer training course. But by World War II, all of our officers had the same training. You know, you didn't have Indiana training and Georgia training. It was all the same thing because we wanted to institutionalize excellence in our military. Likewise, do we have a local process, or should we have a statewide cut that we set that somebody can tell you, I'm sorry, you're just not going to be a principal, go back and be a teacher?
Well, the key is going through the program, you set the benchmarks or those competencies throughout, so that here's step one, you meet this competency. If they can't, you don't go on, they have to be successful here to continue. And at that point, you can either give them an opportunity to improve or coach them out, because but they just cannot continue. So you don't wait till the very end of the program, and that's what so many do, is they wait till the very end, and when they can't get through their final exit exam, then they say, well, you can't get certified, you can't get your degree. That's too late. It's got to be done as you go through the program, and that's how you keep those who really don't need to be there. And you know, you're doing them a favor too, because you're telling them up front, you haven't been able to successfully complete part one. There's no way they can go on and successfully do part two if they couldn't get one done.
Does the state board in Georgia have the power to shut down leader prep programs?
The PSC does, and we are implementing next year a performance-based assessment for those who are completing the Tier 2 leadership program that leads to licensure certification. So if they cannot pass that performance-based test, where they have to actually do leadership work in schools, collect data, submit that for national scoring, then they will not get a certificate. So that is a gate.
I know there's a gate to keep the bottom 8% out. I'm not talking about the bottom 8%. What I'm saying is, how do we create a circumstance where there's pressure on the system, where the system has to adjust itself to make sure we're putting great leaders in the process? And my guess is the licensure gate is probably too low, and it needs to be for the right reasons.
It's getting higher, though, I will argue.
But I will say, our state Department of Education and state board did a piece of legislation a year ago that now gives preparation programs, whether they be traditional or non-traditional, a report card. It's really changed how we're letting people in our program, because it wants to see how many people applied, how many people finished. They want to know how many of the people that we finished are working in low-performing schools. Even though I don't control who hires, it's going to help me help them get hired. And so it's a lot of criteria based on some national data about what good preparation is. So that has really changed the game in our state, and they've done it for teacher education too, about holding us accountable as universities or alternative programs to making sure we're not just letting anyone in the gate. And they've really changed it. It's like no one gets in our gate that doesn't have a minimum of so many years of teaching and leadership experience.
Okay, very good. Let me thank again Dr. Wilson, Dr. Daniel, Dr. Katnick, and Dr. Fleming for, first of all, your time and your expertise, your knowledge of this being with us today. I'm sure you had things to do back home, and most of us can be assured that nobody's done it for you, so it's waiting on you. But thank you for being here. This has been a great time of discussion, and I'm sure this will benefit us greatly. Glenn, you got any closing comments for the panel?
Again, just to echo your thanks and the committee thanks, Chairman Wilbanks. Again, we have admired and respected the work of these individuals. And as Paul reminds me, the work's not ever done. And perhaps it should never be done. So it's an ongoing opportunity for us to improve. And again, I'm just so grateful that they came of their own accord. All it took was a fairly simple invitation to tell them what we were doing here, what this committee was doing. And they said, we'll come, we'll help. tell us how we can help. So again, Dr. Fleming, Dr. Daniel, Dr. Wilson, Dr. Catton, we greatly, greatly appreciate your time, your energy, and your passion for making leadership everything it should be for the benefit of all children. So thank you very much. Mr. Wilbanks, do we want to give them an opportunity because, again, they will need to be leaving here shortly?
Yeah, I think we, you want to take a stretch break while they depart, and if you have anything you need to tell them, please do so. Requirements. Somewhere neighboring around 64, 65%, which is, we wish we'd gotten one for everybody, but it's almost impossible to do that. But we did get, I think, Glenn, the thing here says 62.2% responded, but we did have two or three more beyond that.
Yes, sir. The actual total response was more like 64%.
Right.
Yes, sir.
So,
well, Alvin, I didn't fill it out, but if you'd have offered me like a Starbucks card, I might have. So maybe in the future,
you know, Will, I was having a check to see if yours come back, and we set it aside. We didn't see it, no, really. We'll give you the opportunity to go ahead and fill one out. Dr. Pethel, and we do need to move fairly quickly on this because it's something you can take with you and read, but sort of sum it up for us in about 10 minutes, and is there any questions?
Each of you should have a summary of that in your folder. And so I'll use that as a guide and just point out some of the things that I think are especially important for you to consider. So first of all, start with, remember that this was a possible 14-item survey. A few of the questions built on some logic. In other words, if you answered yes, you were then directed to complete additional questions. So there were only a grand total of 14 questions. Of the 14, 6 were open-ended, designed to give the respondent ample opportunity to expand or offer as much information or as little as they chose. So what you see on your summary, you see those two graphs right in the middle of page 1. And the first one I think is really important because it shows that with the 112 plus respondents, we had very good geographic representation. So superintendents from all parts of the state responded. And you know, it's a fairly equal looking distribution here. But what you see in the second graph I think is also important. And this graph shows that 84% of the 112 respondents came from school districts of what we would call relatively small in size. In other words, school districts with less than 20,000 kids. So again, to often answer that question, are we listening to some of those districts that do represent a significant number, at least in terms of school districts and school leaders? The answer is yes. On the next page, if you'll turn there, you'll begin to see a summary of those open-ended responses. And if any of the committee members would like to see all of the responses, Chairman Wilbanks, we would be more than happy to prepare those, or we actually have them prepared, could send those if you would like. But what you have here, question number 1, about what do you believe or what do you feel is greatest needs in the field. And it's interesting. So you see superintendent says, give them hands-on experience. Give them the opportunity to practice the craft. So we heard some of that conversation earlier today. So 15% said, give them that opportunity to bridge the gap between theory and practice. I think most of us would agree with that, that would be a need. The next general response was about school climate. again, 20% of the respondents said, we really need help. We want principals especially to understand all of the nuances, all of the elements that are necessary to create a climate that is hospitable to all of the stakeholders. And again, the research we know is very pervasive that says that creating that climate, sometimes we use the word culture, is one of those key practices of effective principals. Developing a pipeline. So we talked about that this morning, how one of the states saw that succession planning was a real need. And you see that 24% of our respondents here in Georgia believe that creating that pipeline, succession planning is important. And finally, we see 14% saying that improving teacher effectiveness, becoming more effective as an instructional leader is really important. The second question, open-ended, in what ways do you believe these needs could be potentially met through the creation of state-supported leadership academy? And what we saw in the responses is that, generally speaking, the superintendents were very supportive of the idea of state-supported leadership academy. And 15 of the superintendents said, yeah, we like the idea of consistency. Another term that came through with this particular question was organization. So it would be great if we had some organization. You heard me earlier today use the word framework. So providing some framework or some consistency. So again, I think this is borne out in the responses to that question. In addition, there was some response that reveals that make sure that you provide this on a regional basis. So I'm now referring to comments on page 3 of the report that you have. And you can see here that many of the respondents said that RESUBs were the preferred providers. Again, superintendent said getting that hands-on clinical experience is really important. And some of the superintendents specifically mentioned the superintendent's professional development program, a program that some of you are familiar with, but they suggested that that also might be a model worth studying for future guidance. The next open-ended, what specific needs exist within your district in terms of school leader prep? Again, respondents said, well, I get some of the support, either we've provided it, we've developed it, or I've developed it in concert or in partnership with someone else. But again, this question and the responses give us some insight with superintendents say, I need help finding competent mentors, coaches. And I thought this was an interesting comment. We need our principal supervisors to have training or having more guidance with coaching. There were what I would consider to be some of the usual requests. Give us more help with HR, give us help with legal issues, give us help with some of the just-in-time things that we all need. The next question, you see a chart, you see the number of respondents by district size, but it responds to the question, how are these needs being met? And you can see that overall 27.9% said it's through internal, 5.4% said it's only external, 64% said, well, it's a combination of both. And I suppose it's unfortunate that 4.7% of the districts of size less than 5,000 said nothing is provided. The next question, does your district provide leader prep professional development for aspiring principals? Overwhelmingly, the respondents responded to this and said, yes, we do provide that kind of development. So it tells us that superintendents are cognizant of that need and paying attention to it. A question that we asked specifically, Mr. Schofield, I think you and Scott Justice perhaps, but particularly you, had wanted to know about paid residency. Obviously, what you see on the pie chart on page 4 shows that there are very, very few who are providing any kind of paid residency. Over on page 5, you see part B of that. And this, again, I think is a very revealing chart. So we ask, if you are providing things internally, externally, a combination of both, how happy, how satisfied are with those things that you're providing? And if you look to the overall lower right corner, you'll see that the average satisfaction is 6.8 on a 10-point scale. So even though we're providing some things, you'll notice that the vast majority, 55.6%, said I'm moderately satisfied. 41% said I'm highly satisfied. But again, I would offer that this gives us some insight into opportunities to improve our work. The next open-ended question is to provide professional development to novice leaders after they are placed. The insight here is very positive, that the majority, 82% of superintendents says, yeah, absolutely, we recognize the need and that we're providing that. Again, I believe this survey is providing us, providing you as a study committee contemplating next action, gives us an opportunity to hear from certainly a very important group of stakeholders, our superintendents across the state. Be happy to answer any questions or any comments that you may have.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Bethel, for hearing that. We have one item that we call, you can find you time, but we do need to complete particular one assignment. You have the model, copy of the model.
Yes.
Recognition. This is a draft model.
Yes.
What I think might be good for us to do is we could divide up in 2 groups, if you don't mind us doing that. I would like to ask members of the General Assembly if they would chair those groups, if that's okay. And what we would like to do is just review the draft model here, based on what you've heard, what the research has indicated. What about this looks to be meaningful? What about this might offer possibilities? What of it do you not like? From the very beginning, I think we've indicated that Senator Higbee reviewed this with us today, the legislation. The legislation calls for there to be a statewide leadership academy. It also focuses on the local form, and there's no reason that we cannot do both of those simultaneously. And in fact, we probably need to do simultaneously. And there might be a number of things that work for a generic model that's good for the turnaround, but then there are specific things that we need to be very different. There's no reason we can't develop both of them simultaneously. But then we've heard a lot of other things about, if you just have a school, if the school is the only school in the district, well, the school in the district is somewhat the same. Even though you may have a district office, but still, the capabilities are pretty much the same, but then when you get into the size of districts, and I don't know, or Will, you may have a view of this as well as the rest of it. But if you get around 25,000 students, then generally there's some capability within that district, or should be, to provide the services. As you go on up the ladder in terms of numbers, there's a lot more support the district can provide. And I think we all agree that nobody can be exempt from this. Certainly the teacher, the principal make the big difference. But also district leadership makes a difference if it's providing the right support for the students, if it's doing the right thing. And I think the model that you see there provides for a number of things that we may not want to do this time, we may not can do it this time, but as we develop this, should we provide at least a skeleton, a framework where we can provide when the need arises and when we can fulfill maybe the first two priorities, maybe it can be addressed. In addition, we heard a lot today about, I believe he called them regional leadership specialists. So we've heard that we heard from our research meetings ago. We've also heard from other organizations, professional organizations that are doing some of this. So there's no reason that we can't utilize the services, some of the structures that are in place. But I believe the number one thing that I heard throughout, particularly today, and if you read the research, there does need to be a structure, and that structure needs to clearly identify your focus, your vision, and what it is that, what's the outcome that you get from going through a leadership academy. Are you then able to lead and manage a school? Are you able to do, as I believe it may have been General Eisenhower that said, really true leaders are able, not just able to have you do what you need to do, but true leaders make you want being the operative word, make you want to do what it is that you're supposed to do. Well, that's a cultural piece. You got to work on that piece, and we know that particularly the low performance schools, the culture there is just as important as the culture is in any other school if they're to be effective. So I think there are a lot of things that we would really want to consider or look at, but I do think we need to begin putting some meat to a skeleton to where we be February 1st. I'm not just interested in meeting the deadline, but there's no need not meeting it either. So let us work to that end, and I think today, if you could give us a lot of feedback concentrated into 2 or 3 points from each group, that would be very meaningful to us. What are the 2 or 3 things that you've heard, that you know, that the research bears out that our model really should have? Let me stop and see if I'm clear or if I'm muddy on the instructions. Okay. All right, so we could maybe, Senator Tippins, maybe, I guess, maybe if you stay where you are and fill in here with about 3 or 4, we sort of want to divide you up a little bit where you want to in if we could sort of put out the 2 to 3 things that we think we're moving down the right track on, that you like about what you heard today, what you see in the Bible, different schools.
Yeah, a hard challenge to say 2 or 3 things with people who like to talk. So, Elevator speech, okay. We definitely agree with the structure of the organization chart. We did look at, they break it down, the instructional focus and operational focus. And also wondering in that operational focus, the inclusiveness of how the community involvement piece comes in there. And we talked about the collaboration that was important. And also, where does the school inclusiveness of school board members fit in the leadership model that's on the paper as well, on the chart. I think it's 1, 2, 3. We even talked about if we looked at the incentive, how you incentivize, and then even with the 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. That was mentioned on with the presenters of the panelists, how you have to cover for what mention that the principals are covered when they have to leave that particular building. So that goes back to the old collaboration part, and then we even talked about the MOU that comes back to the school board members being involved in the very beginning with having the MOU with the district, with the leadership academy for the state to allow that flexibility for the participants. They're going to be in the program and show that commitment. Tim, did I need to add anything else? Okay.
Yeah,
The
very
coaching
good.
was very
Thank you.
important.
Anybody take any notes on that?
I'm speaking for the brain trust that's out there. We actually had a very good, lively discussion. I love those in particular order. I will start, I guess, from the top of the org chart down. Not necessarily level of importance. One thing we did talk about was a advisory board that's maybe stronger than a typical advisory board that's made up of principals, perhaps that have been through this in the previous 5 to 6 years. So they're not 20-year principals who've sort of forgotten how to learn about this. They've been doing it reflexively. The people that are more into this program that are graduates that can really look at the ongoing relevancy of this, not from an academic perspective, not from a legislative perspective, but from a practitioner's perspective, to kind of keep that wisdom close to the kind of the leadership of the organization. Secondly, a program evaluation process that was externally evaluated, that to really evaluate the efficacy of this program, to have something, its own organization that's sort of maybe above this org chart, that evaluates every single function with the brutal honesty that kids deserve, and be an external evaluation. It's just so easy to become insular in assessing your own performance. Thirdly, a more rigorous candidate evaluation process than perhaps there in anything else in the state. That if you think about people that are coming in that are provided by districts to go be potential principals, if we give a brutally honest evaluation, a very rigorous evaluation, that initially nothing's attached to. We're not turning people away, we're not year 1, year 2. If we build a process where we're really evaluating these candidates on every axis of evaluation early on, there's some people we're going to see that we have some real questions about. We'll take them through the process, and as we measure that, we'll be able to look down the road. If they turn out to have problems as a principal, we kind of saw these things early on in districts. We saw these competencies weren't here initially. We kind of raised these as questions, and it will inform us in year 4 or 5 and beyond. And then perhaps at that point, we could be in a place where saying, we've got 5 years of data on this. We don't think we should accept your person to school because history's shown us this evaluation tool we've done early on as a sort of an onboarding of the program is proven that we're pretty good at knowing who good candidates are. We don't think your person's a good candidate. But initially, it'll just be a measurement tool to be very rigorous. Next, and I guess the last big thing we'd say is the question of standardization. Our friend from Missouri highlighted for us, these 4 different levels of aspiring leaders and sort of emerging and developing leaders. That whole process, as you start that process, does it make sense? If we're in a context of resources not being super constrained, what's the best thing operationally should we do a 1 week long boot camp where you can both indoctrinate people with the program, you can bring people all around the state to one place, almost like Georgia Public Safety Training Center, GPSTC. That's a longer program. But we decided 50 years ago to put somebody out there as a law enforcement officer with a firearm. There needed to be some standardization. So you shrink that down to a 1 week process that allows you really to do this kind of evaluation we talked about. You can see them in a residential setting, 10 hours a day over a week. And then you're really able to kind of give them all the things they have to know, you know, manual reporting, training, all those things they gotta know, but it's also a way to evaluate them. And then really the rest of the training process is that in the school, in their setting kind of program that we talked about earlier. So those are kind of the 4 things we highlighted as elements.
Great, great. Okay, Mr. Chairman.
I think the consensus of our discussion was that we agree with the adoption of this framework with the understanding that it will be a staged adoption or implementation. I had missed the point that the parks in blue were the top priorities. I think as capacity grows, you could expand it on that, but you would start with the 2 blue boxes and really run parallel concurrent tracks, both the principles of good principle preparation, but also specific instruction in the areas for the low performing schools, the turnaround school, realizing that part of it is general or basic instruction, leadership instruction, the other is more specialized or specific. We agree that there should be a standardized program curriculum throughout the state. It probably in utilization of regional instruction would make sure that the content is the same in all the programs, and that's standard throughout the state regardless of location. It'd also be a guaranteed proficiency of instructors, and there'd be a screening process for those people who would be delivering the instruction and involved in the mentoring program. One of the things we talked about was as a recommendation of this, the importance of team building in a school, and the fact that you may have some schools that may have a total of 200 students. You may not have the ability to build assistant principals, but also the training would show how to pull other professionals into school, into leadership support positions, even though they may not necessarily have the time to try to build the pipelines within the school in the event the principal left, that you have some continuity in the school. We really didn't have that as one of the points, but I think that's really important, and it was in our discussion.
Okay. Very good. Okay, is there any other points on this that questions that you might have? Sure, I thought those were very good points that you brought up.
I just want to add one thing. We had a discussion about the East Class money, and maybe even looking at legislation, we gave that I think it was maybe up to 10% may have to go towards leadership development. This is something that you kind of go out on the table. For those times that the school districts might not necessarily have to do it, they might just be doing capital improvement, but not necessarily having to build a school. And so that money's kind of sitting there. I think we've had discussions about that on the education committee as well. So that might be a possibility.
I was not trying to overhear what you were saying over there, but what I heard you saying was you'd take districts that didn't have any schools on the list and then start at the biggest and maybe take 15-20% from those school districts, East Blos, and then work your way on down. And that would, I thought that's what I heard you saying.
I'm gonna give Will my hair.
Oh, he made me go to the doctor and get his own.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
It's a shame you're gonna have to go back to Gainesville in a box.
All right, well, listen, today's been a long day. I hope you found it to be a very profitable day. I thought the panel members did a very good job and pointed out some things that certainly resonated with all of us. And we, I don't know how your own view of how we're progressing, but I sort of think we made some progress last couple of meetings. Hopefully, by meeting 4, which is coming up, I think, November 1st, hopefully you'll see us maybe down and track a little bit. So we'll try to have a little bit more time for the discussion. Although we've had a lot of discussion, a lot has been question or response to that, I do think, at least I have enjoyed the comments. And there's probably a couple, 3 things that I probably wouldn't want to do. On the other hand, there are a whole lot of things I heard that I would want to do. I think would really put us down the road while we're on today. You all have been great members to give us your attention. Hopefully we'll have a full crew next week, next month. It actually will be November 1st, I think, is our next meeting. With that, is there any other business that we need to take care of today? Okay. We'll declare the meeting adjourned. See you next meeting. Thank you.